Inside the cockpit, someone had pulled every single circuit breaker. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. The plane was falling, and we had no idea who was responsible. What happens when you're working the graveyard shift at 30,000 feet, and the person sitting 3 rows behind you isn't supposed to be alive? When security cameras capture footage of someone who knows every blind spot in the terminal, someone who shouldn't have access? When you hear breathing behind you in an empty aircraft hangar, but when you turn around, there's nothing there? Tonight, I'm sharing 11 true stories from airline workers who experienced the unthinkable during their night shifts. Stories so disturbing that some of these employees quit their jobs the very next day. These aren't urban legends or creepypastas. These are verified accounts from flight attendants, ground crew, maintenance workers, and security personnel who lived through experiences that will haunt them forever. Stories involving mysterious passengers who vanish from passenger manifests, sabotage attempts that nearly killed hundreds, and encounters with individuals who seem to know things they shouldn't know. You'll hear about the MMA fighter who went into a rage at 35,000 feet while passengers screamed in terror. The maintenance worker who discovered someone had systematically disabled every safety system on a Boeing 737. The security guard who watched 3 days of cascading failures that seemed too coordinated to be coincidental. And the night shift supervisor who suffered a fatal heart attack after witnessing something so disturbing, his colleagues refuse to speak about it to this day. If you're ready to hear stories that will make you question everything you thought you knew about airline safety, hit that subscribe button right now and ring the notification bell. Trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next on Verified Fears. But I have to warn you, after hearing story number 7, you might never feel safe on a plane again. Because sometimes, the most terrifying thing about flying isn't the possibility of a crash. It's the realization that someone on board has been planning something far worse. Let's begin with a story that started like any other night shift, until a passenger who had been dead for 6 hours walked onto the plane. Let's move to our first story. Sophia Rodriguez had been working as a night shift flight attendant for Delta Airlines for over 8 years, and she thought she'd seen everything. Red-eye flights from Los Angeles to Atlanta were her specialty. Dealing with drunk businessmen, crying babies, and the occasional medical emergency had become routine. But nothing in her training had prepared her for what happened on Flight 1247 on a cold Tuesday night in October. The Boeing 757 was only half full, which was typical for the 11:47 p.m. departure. Sophia was working with just one other flight attendant, Marcus, a veteran with 15 years of experience who had requested the night shifts specifically because they were usually quieter. As passengers boarded, Sophia noticed the usual mix of business travelers trying to catch some sleep and a few tourists heading back east after their California vacation. Everything seemed normal during the safety demonstration. The passengers were settling in, most already pulling out their phones for one last check before takeoff. Sophia was making her final walk through the cabin, ensuring seatbelts were fastened and tray tables were up, when she noticed him for the first time, seat 14C. A middle-aged man in a dark business suit, probably in his 50s, with graying hair and pale skin. What struck her immediately was how still he was sitting. While other passengers were adjusting their seats, reaching for magazines, or chatting quietly, this man sat perfectly upright, staring straight ahead at the seat back in front of him. His hands were folded precisely in his lap, and he hadn't moved since she'd started her walkthrough. "Sir, we'll be taking off shortly. Please make sure your seatbelt is securely fastened," Sophia said, stopping beside his row. The man didn't respond, didn't even blink. Sir? Sophia leaned closer, thinking perhaps he was wearing earbuds she couldn't see. That's when she noticed something that made her stomach drop. The man wasn't breathing. His chest wasn't rising and falling. There was no subtle movement, no sign of life whatsoever. Sophia's training kicked in immediately. She'd dealt with medical emergencies before. Heart attacks, seizures, even a death during flight. But those situations always involved some kind of distress call, someone noticing a passenger in trouble, or obvious signs of medical crisis. This was different. This man had apparently boarded the plane, taken his seat, and died without anyone noticing. Marcus, Sophia called quietly to her colleague, who was checking overhead bins 3 rows ahead. I need you here. Marcus approached with the casual confidence of someone who'd handled countless minor issues over the years. But when Sophia whispered what she'd observed, his expression changed completely. Are you sure? Marcus asked, leaning down to look at the passenger more closely. That's when they both noticed something even more disturbing. The man's skin had a waxy, artificial quality to it. Not the pale complexion of someone who might be ill, but the unmistakable appearance of someone who had been dead for hours. His lips had a slight blue tinge, and when Marcus carefully reached out to check for a pulse at the man's wrist, the skin was cold to the touch. Jesus Christ, Marcus whispered, pulling his hand back. Sophia, this man has been dead for hours. How did he get on this plane? Sophia's mind was racing. She'd watched the boarding process. She'd seen passengers presenting their boarding passes, walking down the jet bridge, finding their seats. She couldn't remember specifically seeing this man board. But that wasn't unusual. With over 100 passengers, she didn't memorize every face. But if he had been dead for hours, as Marcus suggested, how had he gotten through security? How had he presented a boarding pass? How had he walked onto the plane and taken his seat? We need to contact the captain immediately, Sophia said. But Marcus was already reaching for the interphone. While Marcus spoke quietly with Captain Rodriguez, Sophia found herself staring at the dead passenger, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. The man's eyes were open, staring straight ahead with a glassy, unfocused look. His mouth was slightly open, as if he'd been in the middle of saying something when death occurred. But most disturbing of all was his posture. Perfectly upright, hands folded, seatbelt fastened. It was as if someone had carefully positioned him to look like a normal passenger. Captain Rodriguez's voice came over the interphone, asking Sophia to come to the cockpit immediately. She made her way forward, her legs feeling unsteady, trying to maintain her professional composure while her mind struggled to process what was happening. Sophia, I need you to tell me exactly what you observed, Captain Rodriguez said, his voice calm but serious. Marcus says you have a deceased passenger in 14C, but there's a problem with that. What kind of problem? Sophia asked. I just checked our passenger manifest. Seat 14C is listed as unoccupied. According to our records, that seat was never sold for this flight. Sophia felt the blood drain from her face. That's impossible. There's someone sitting there right now. I believe you, Captain Rodriguez said. But according to the gate agent's final count, we have 127 passengers on board. That matches exactly with the number of boarding passes scanned. If there's someone in 14C, then either our count is wrong or... He didn't finish the sentence, but Sophia understood the implication. Either their systems had failed catastrophically, or somehow a person who hadn't purchased a ticket, hadn't gone through security, and hadn't scanned a boarding pass had gotten onto their aircraft. A person who appeared to have been dead for hours. "Captain, what do you want us to do?" Sophia asked. "We're going back to the gate. I'm not taking off with an unaccounted passenger, especially under these circumstances." "But Sophia, I need you to do something for me. I want you to go back and take a photo of this passenger with your phone. We're going to need documentation of this." Sophia nodded and made her way back through the cabin. Some passengers were starting to look restless, checking their watches and wondering why they hadn't started taxiing yet. She tried to smile reassuringly as she passed, but her heart was pounding. When she reached row 14, she stopped dead in her tracks. The seat was empty. Sophia stared at the vacant seat, her mind reeling. The seat belt was still fastened, but buckled around nothing. The seat was in the same upright position, but there was no one sitting in it. She looked around frantically, thinking perhaps the man had gotten up to use the restroom, but she hadn't seen anyone pass her in the narrow aisle. "Marcus!" she called out, trying to keep her voice low enough not to alarm the passengers. Marcus hurried over, and when he saw the empty seat, his face went white. "Where did he go?" "I don't know. I was only gone for 3 minutes, maybe 4. You were here the whole time. Did you see him get up?" "Sophia, I've been watching this section of the cabin since you left. No one has moved from their seats. No one." They both stood there, staring at the empty seat, trying to process what had happened. The passenger in 14A, a young woman with headphones on, looked up at them curiously. "Excuse me," Sophia said to her. "Did you see the gentleman who was sitting next to you get up?" The woman pulled out one earbud. "What gentleman?" "That seat's been empty since I sat down. I was actually happy about it because I thought I'd have more room." Sophia and Marcus exchanged glances. "Ma'am, are you sure? There was a man in a dark suit sitting right there just a few minutes ago." The woman looked at them like they were crazy. "I've been sitting here for 20 minutes. Trust me, if someone had been sitting right next to me, I would have noticed. That seat's been empty the whole time." Marcus leaned down and whispered to Sophia, "Ask the passengers behind him." Sophia turned to the couple in row 15. "Excuse me, did either of you notice a man sitting in the seat in front of you?" 14C? The husband looked confused. "No, that seat's been empty. We were just commenting on how lucky the lady in 14A was to have extra space." Sophia felt like she was losing her mind. She and Marcus had both seen the man. They had both observed that he appeared to be dead. Marcus had touched his cold skin. But now, not only was the man gone, but other passengers were insisting he had never been there at all. "Sophia," Marcus said quietly, "we need to check the lavatories. Maybe he got up while we were both distracted." They quickly checked both lavatories in their section. Empty. They asked the passengers near the lavatories if they'd seen anyone go in. No one had. Sophia even asked the passengers in the very back of the plane if they'd seen a man in a dark suit walk past them. Nothing. The man had simply vanished. Captain Rodriguez's voice came over the interphone again, asking for an update. Sophia picked up the phone with trembling hands. "Captain, the passenger's gone." "Gone? What do you mean, gone?" "I mean the seat is empty. And the other passengers are saying no one was ever sitting there." There was a long pause. "Sophia, Are you telling me that you and Marcus both observed a deceased passenger who, according to our manifest, shouldn't have been on the plane, and now the passenger has disappeared and other passengers claim he was never there? Yes, sir. That's exactly what I'm telling you. Another pause. We're still going back to the gate. I want security to board this aircraft and conduct a complete search. And Sophia, I want you and Marcus to write down everything you remember about this passenger, every detail. We're going to need a full report. As the plane taxied back to the gate, Sophia tried to reconstruct what had happened. She could still clearly remember the man's appearance, the dark suit, the graying hair, the pale, waxy skin. She remembered the cold touch of his skin when Marcus checked for a pulse. She remembered his glassy, staring eyes and the way he sat perfectly still, like a mannequin positioned to look like a passenger. But now she was starting to doubt her own memory. Had she really seen what she thought she'd seen? Was it possible that the stress of night shifts and the dim cabin lighting had caused her to hallucinate? But Marcus had seen him too, had touched him, had confirmed that the man was dead. When they reached the gate, airport security boarded immediately. They conducted a thorough search of the entire aircraft, checking every seat, every lavatory, every storage compartment. They found nothing. No sign that anyone had been in seat 14C, other than the fact that the seatbelt was still fastened. The security chief, a stern woman named Detective Morrison, interviewed Sophia and Marcus separately. Sophia told her story exactly as she remembered it, providing as much detail as possible about the man's appearance and condition. When she finished, Detective Morrison looked at her with a mixture of skepticism and concern. Ms. Rodriguez, I've been doing this job for 12 years. I've seen a lot of strange things happen at airports. But what you're describing is impossible. A deceased person cannot board an aircraft. They cannot pass through security, present a boarding pass, or take a seat. And they certainly cannot disappear into thin air. I know how it sounds, Sophia said. But I know what I saw. Marcus saw it too. Yes, Mr. Thompson corroborated your story, which is the only reason I'm not dismissing this entirely. But I need you to consider the possibility that you both experienced some kind of shared hallucination or misperception. Sophia wanted to argue, but she was starting to wonder the same thing herself. How could what she'd experienced be real? Detective Morrison continued. I'm going to review all the security footage from the gate area and the jet bridge. If someone boarded this aircraft who wasn't supposed to be there, we'll find evidence of it. But, Ms. Rodriguez, if we don't find anything, I think you should consider talking to someone about the stress you might be under. The security review took 2 hours. They examined footage from every camera angle, reviewed the boarding pass scans, and cross-referenced the passenger manifest with the actual head count. Everything matched perfectly. 127 passengers had boarded the aircraft. 127 passengers were accounted for. There was no evidence that anyone else had been on the plane. But Detective Morrison did find something that made her reconsider Sophia's story. Ms. Rodriguez, I need to show you something, she said, pulling up a piece of security footage on her laptop. This is from the jet bridge camera, taken about 10 minutes before your scheduled departure. The footage showed the empty jet bridge after all passengers had boarded. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then, for just a few frames, there appeared to be a shadow moving along the wall of the jet bridge. Not a person, just a shadow. as if someone was walking along the bridge, but wasn't visible to the camera. "Do you see that?" Detective Morrison asked. Sophia leaned closer to the screen. "That shadow. It's moving like someone's walking, but there's no one there." "Exactly. And here's the strange part. This shadow appears to be moving toward the aircraft, not away from it. This was recorded after the final passenger count, after the jet bridge should have been empty." Sophia felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you think it means?" Detective Morrison closed the laptop. "Honestly, I don't know. It could be a technical glitch with the camera, a reflection from somewhere else, or..." She paused. "Or it could be evidence that something happened that we don't understand." The flight was eventually canceled. The passengers were rebooked on other flights, and the aircraft was taken out of service for a complete inspection. Nothing unusual was found. Sophia and Marcus were both given a week of paid leave to recover from the incident. When Sophia returned to work, she requested to be transferred to day shifts. She never worked another red-eye flight. But the story doesn't end there. 3 months later, Sophia received a call from Detective Morrison. Another flight attendant, working for a different airline, had reported an almost identical incident. A deceased passenger in a seat that was supposed to be empty, who then vanished without a trace. The details were so similar that Detective Morrison wondered if there was a connection. Over the next year, Detective Morrison documented 6 more similar incidents across different airlines and airports. Always on night flights, always involving a passenger who appeared to be dead, sitting in a seat that wasn't supposed to be occupied. And always ending with the passenger's mysterious disappearance and other passengers insisting no one had ever been there. The airline industry quietly began referring to these incidents as phantom passenger cases. There was never any official acknowledgement of the phenomenon, no press releases or public statements. But among night shift crews, word spread. Flight attendants began checking passenger manifests more carefully, paying closer attention to passengers who seemed too still, too quiet. Sophia never saw the man in the dark suit again. But sometimes, during her day shifts, she would find herself scanning the passengers, looking for that telltale stillness, that waxy complexion, those glassy, staring eyes. And sometimes, late at night when she couldn't sleep, she would wonder, who was he? How did he get on that plane? And most disturbing of all, where did he go? The official report listed the incident as unexplained passenger discrepancy and was filed away in a database that very few people have access to. But Sophia knows what she saw. Marcus knows what he touched. And Detective Morrison knows that sometimes things happen in the sky that can't be explained by logic or reason. The man in seat 14C remains a mystery. But for those who work the night shift in aviation, he serves as a reminder that at 30,000 feet, in the darkness between destinations, the impossible sometimes becomes possible. And that's just the beginning of what airline workers experience when the sun goes down. Let's move to our second story. David Chen had been working aircraft maintenance for United Airlines at Denver International Airport for 6 years, and he'd grown accustomed to the eerie atmosphere of the overnight shift. The massive hangars were dimly lit after midnight, filled with the skeletal forms of grounded aircraft undergoing routine inspections and repairs. Most mechanics preferred the day shift, but David actually enjoyed the solitude and the premium pay that came with working the graveyard hours. What he didn't enjoy was what happened on a frigid November night that would make him question everything he thought he knew about the aircraft he serviced. It was 2:17 a.m. when David received his assignment for the night. perform a routine inspection on a Boeing 777 that had just completed a red-eye flight from Tokyo. The aircraft, tail number N847UA, was parked in Hangar 7, one of the older maintenance facilities at DEN. The hangar was cavernous, its ceiling disappearing into shadows even with the overhead lights on. David had worked on hundreds of aircraft in this hangar, but something felt different as he approached the 777 that night. The first thing he noticed was how quiet it was. Usually, even hours after landing, an aircraft would still be making subtle settling noises. Metal contracting as it cooled, hydraulic systems occasionally cycling, the soft hum of auxiliary power units. But this 777 was completely silent, as if it had been sitting there for days rather than having just arrived from an international flight. David began his standard exterior inspection, walking around the aircraft with his flashlight and checklist. Everything appeared normal. Landing gear properly positioned, no visible damage to the fuselage, engines showing no signs of stress or unusual wear. It was when he moved to inspect the cargo holds that he first heard it. Footsteps. They were coming from inside the aircraft, specifically from the passenger cabin above him. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving from the front of the plane toward the rear. David stopped and listened carefully. The footsteps were distinct, the sound of someone walking down the center aisle of the aircraft. David's first thought was that a cleaning crew was still working inside the plane. It wasn't unusual for cleaning to continue well into the night, especially after long international flights. But when he checked his work order, there was no mention of cleaning crew activity. According to the schedule, the aircraft had been cleaned and cleared hours ago. He walked to the front of the aircraft where the boarding stairs were still attached. The cabin door was closed and locked, which was standard procedure for aircraft in maintenance. David used his security badge to unlock the door and climbed the stairs into the cabin. The interior of the 777 was completely dark except for the emergency lighting strips along the floor. David called out, "Hello. Maintenance here. Is anyone still working in the cabin?" No response. He turned on his flashlight and began walking through the first-class section. The seats were all in their upright positions, tray tables stowed, everything neat and orderly as expected after cleaning. But as he moved deeper into the aircraft, David could smell something that made his stomach turn. It was a musty, stale odor, like old clothes that had been stored in a damp basement for years. David continued through business class and into the main economy cabin. The smell grew stronger, and he noticed something else. The temperature seemed to be dropping as he moved toward the rear of the aircraft. His breath was beginning to fog in the beam of his flashlight. That's when he heard the footsteps again. They were directly above him now, coming from the upper deck of the 777. But David knew that was impossible. This particular aircraft configuration didn't have passenger seating on the upper deck. It was used entirely for crew rest areas and storage. More importantly, there was no way to access the upper deck without going through the main cabin, and David had just walked the entire length of the plane without seeing anyone. The footsteps continued, moving methodically from one end of the upper deck to the other. David could hear them clearly now. The distinct sound of someone wearing hard-soled shoes walking on the aircraft's flooring. But there was something wrong with the rhythm. The steps were too slow, too deliberate, as if whoever was walking was having difficulty moving. David found the access ladder to the upper deck and climbed up, his flashlight beam dancing ahead of him. The upper deck was divided into several small crew rest compartments, each containing bunk beds for flight attendants and pilots on long-haul flights. David checked each compartment systematically, but they were all empty. The footsteps had stopped. David stood in the narrow corridor of the upper deck, listening intently. The silence was absolute now, broken only by the sound of his own breathing. But the smell was stronger up here, almost overwhelming. It wasn't just mustiness now. There was something else, something organic and unpleasant that David couldn't identify. He was about to head back down when he noticed something that made his blood run cold. At the far end of the upper deck corridor, barely visible in the dim emergency lighting, there were wet footprints on the carpet. David approached the footprints carefully, his flashlight beam focused on the floor. The prints were clearly defined. The outline of dress shoes, size 10 or 11, leading from one of the crew rest compartments to the end of the corridor. But the prints weren't made with water. The liquid was dark, almost black, and had a thick, viscous consistency. David knelt down and examined the prints more closely. The liquid had a metallic smell that mixed sickeningly with the musty odor that permeated the upper deck. He was no expert, but the dark liquid looked disturbingly like blood. Standing up quickly, David followed the trail of footprints back to their source. They led to the last crew rest compartment on the left side of the aircraft. The compartment door was closed, but David could see that the dark liquid had seeped out from underneath it. David's training told him to call security immediately. Whatever was in that compartment, it wasn't something a maintenance worker should be dealing with alone. But his curiosity and sense of responsibility for the aircraft overrode his caution. He reached for the compartment door handle. The door was locked. David tried his master key, but it wouldn't turn. He tried his security badge on the electronic lock, but it showed a red light. Access denied. This was strange because maintenance personnel were supposed to have access to all areas of the aircraft during inspections. As David stood there trying to figure out how to open the door, he heard something that made his heart stop. From inside the compartment came the sound of breathing. Not the steady breathing of someone sleeping, but labored, raspy breathing, as if someone was struggling for air. "Hello?" David called out, pressing his ear to the door. "Are you okay in there? This is maintenance. I can get you out." The breathing stopped immediately. David waited for a response, but none came. He tried the door handle again, putting his full weight behind it, but it wouldn't budge. The electronic lock continued to show a red light, no matter what he tried. That's when he heard the footsteps again. But this time, they were different. Instead of the slow, deliberate steps he'd heard before, these were rapid, frantic, as if someone was pacing back and forth in the small compartment. The footsteps were accompanied by a scraping sound, like fingernails being dragged across metal. David backed away from the door, his hands shaking as he reached for his radio to call security. But before he could make the call, the sounds from the compartment stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was somehow more terrifying than the sounds had been. David stood in the corridor for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, waiting for something to happen. When nothing did, he made his way back down to the main cabin, his mind racing with questions. Who or what was in that compartment? Why couldn't he access it with his master key? And what was the dark liquid that had leaked out onto the corridor floor? Back in the main cabin, David tried to focus on completing his inspection, but he couldn't concentrate. Every few minutes, he would stop and listen for sounds from above. But the aircraft remained silent. The musty smell had faded somewhat. but David could still detect traces of it in the air. It was while he was inspecting the galley area that David noticed something else unusual. The passenger manifest from the Tokyo flight was still clipped to a clipboard near the forward galley. David wasn't supposed to look at passenger information, but something compelled him to glance at it. The manifest showed 347 passengers and 16 crew members for the flight. But at the bottom of the list, someone had written in red ink, "Additional passenger, upper deck, compartment 7L, do not disturb." David felt a chill run down his spine. Compartment 7L was exactly where he'd heard the breathing and found the locked door. But passengers weren't allowed in crew rest areas, and certainly not in the upper deck compartments. The notation made no sense according to any airline protocol David was familiar with. He took a photo of the manifest with his phone and then called his supervisor, Maria Rodriguez, who was working in another hangar. "Mike, I need you to come to Hangar 7. I've got a situation with the 777 from Tokyo." "What kind of situation?" Mike asked. "I think there might be someone still on board. In one of the upper deck crew compartments. The door's locked and I can't get access." There was a pause. "David, that's impossible. The aircraft was cleared by customs and cleaning crew hours ago. Everyone's accounted for." "I know how it sounds, but I heard breathing coming from compartment 7L, and there's a notation on the passenger manifest about an additional passenger in that exact location." "I'll be right there," Mike said. While waiting for his supervisor, David decided to complete his exterior inspection. He walked around the aircraft again, this time paying closer attention to any signs that someone might have accessed the upper deck from outside. But the 777's upper deck had no external access points. The only way in or out was through the main cabin. Mike arrived 20 minutes later with 2 security guards. David led them up to the upper deck and showed them the locked compartment door. The dark liquid was still visible on the carpet, though it seemed to have dried somewhat. "Jesus, what is that stuff?" one of the security guards asked, kneeling down to examine the stains. "I was hoping you could tell me," David replied. Mike tried his master key on the compartment door, but like David, he couldn't get it to open. The security guards tried their override codes on the electronic lock, but it continued to show a red light. "This doesn't make sense," Mike said. "These locks aren't supposed to deny access to maintenance or security personnel." One of the security guards got on his radio and called for a locksmith. While they waited, David showed them the passenger manifest with the mysterious notation about compartment 7L. "I've never seen anything like this," Mike said, studying the manifest. "Passengers don't get assigned to crew rest areas, and they certainly don't get marked as do not disturb. This has to be some kind of mistake." The locksmith arrived an hour later and spent 45 minutes working on the compartment door. When he finally got it open, everyone held their breath, expecting to find someone inside. The compartment was empty, but it wasn't clean. The small space reeked of the same musty odor David had smelled earlier, but now it was mixed with something else, the unmistakable smell of decay. The bedding was disheveled and stained with the same dark liquid that had been on the corridor floor. The walls of the compartment were scratched, as if someone had been clawing at them. Most disturbing of all, written on the wall in what appeared to be the same dark liquid, were the words, "I couldn't get out." The security guards immediately called for a full investigation. The aircraft was quarantined, and a team of investigators from the FBI and the Airline Security Department descended on Hangar 7. They spent 3 days going over every inch of the 777, collecting samples of the dark liquid, analyzing the scratches on the compartment walls, and interviewing everyone who had been involved with the flight. The results of their investigation were inconclusive and deeply troubling. The dark liquid was confirmed to be human blood, but it was old, at least several weeks old according to the lab analysis. The scratches on the walls were consistent with human fingernails, and DNA analysis of material found under the scratches confirmed that someone had been trapped in that compartment and had desperately tried to claw their way out. But here's where the story becomes truly inexplicable. The passenger manifest for the Tokyo flight was legitimate, and all 347 passengers and 16 crew members were accounted for. Every person who boarded the aircraft in Tokyo was confirmed to have deplaned in Denver. Security footage from both airports showed no evidence of anyone hiding on the aircraft or accessing the upper deck compartments. The mysterious notation about compartment 7L was written in red ink that matched a pen found in the galley, but no one could explain who had written it or why. The handwriting analysis was inconclusive. It didn't match any of the crew members or ground personnel who had access to the aircraft. Most puzzling of all was the age of the blood evidence. If someone had been trapped in that compartment and had died there, it would have happened weeks before the Tokyo flight. But the aircraft had been in continuous service during that time, with daily inspections and regular cleaning. How could a body have remained hidden in a crew rest compartment for weeks without being discovered? The investigation was eventually closed without any definitive answers. The official report stated that unknown biological material had been found in the aircraft, but no explanation was provided for how it got there or who it came from. The 777 was returned to service after extensive cleaning and decontamination. David never worked on that particular aircraft again. He requested to be assigned to different planes, and his supervisor honored the request without question. But the experience changed him. He became hypervigilant during his inspections, always listening for sounds that shouldn't be there, always checking compartments that should be empty. 6 months later, David learned something that made the mystery even more disturbing. A fellow maintenance worker mentioned that the same 777 had been involved in an incident the previous year. A passenger on a flight from Los Angeles to Tokyo had gone missing during the flight. The man had been seen boarding the aircraft. His seat had been occupied during takeoff. But when the plane landed in Tokyo, he was nowhere to be found. The passenger was never located, and the case remained unsolved. The missing passenger's name was Robert Chen, no relation to David despite the shared surname. Robert Chen had been traveling alone, was described as a quiet man in his 50s, and had been assigned to seat 23F in economy class. But according to the flight attendants, he had asked about upgrading to the upper deck crew rest area because he was feeling claustrophobic in the main cabin. The request had been denied, of course. Passengers weren't allowed in crew rest areas under any circumstances. But David couldn't help wondering, what if Robert Chen had found a way to access the upper deck anyway? What if he had somehow gotten trapped in compartment 7L during that flight from Los Angeles to Tokyo? The timeline would match the age of the blood evidence, and it would explain the desperate scratches on the walls, the message written in blood, and the breathing sounds David had heard. But it wouldn't explain how Robert Chen's body had disappeared, or how he had managed to access a locked compartment in the first place. David tried to put the incident behind him, but it haunted his dreams. Sometimes, during his night shifts, he would find himself standing beneath aircraft and listening for footsteps in the cabins above. He never heard them again, but he never stopped listening. The 777 continued to fly regular routes, and as far as David knew, no other maintenance workers reported any unusual incidents. But he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had happened in compartment 7L wasn't over. The aircraft carried the memory of Robert Chen's final moments, and sometimes, in the darkness of the overnight shift, that memory became manifest. David still works at Denver International Airport, but he's never forgotten the night he heard footsteps above and discovered that some passengers never really leave their flights. He's learned that aircraft, like old houses, can hold on to the echoes of tragedy. And in the quiet hours before dawn, when the hangars are empty and the planes sit silent in the darkness, those echoes sometimes become footsteps. The official records show that Robert Chen disappeared somewhere over the Pacific Ocean. But David knows the truth. Robert Chen never left that 777. He's still there, walking the upper deck, trying to find a way out of compartment 7L, leaving bloody footprints that fade with the morning light but return when darkness falls again. And that's why David Chen always checks the upper deck compartments twice during his inspections, and why he never works alone on aircraft that have flown the Los Angeles to Tokyo route. Let's move to our third story. Maria Santos had been working as a gate agent for Southwest Airlines at Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport for 12 years. And she prided herself on being able to handle any passenger situation with professionalism and grace. Working the night shift meant dealing with tired, frustrated travelers, delayed flights, and the occasional unruly passenger. But Maria had seen it all, or so she thought, until the night she encountered the woman with sand in her shoes. It was 1:43 a.m. on a Tuesday in late September when Flight 2847 from Albuquerque pulled up to Gate A7. The flight was running nearly 2 hours behind schedule due to weather delays, and Maria could see the exhaustion on passengers' faces as they deplaned. Most were business travelers or tourists heading home after visiting New Mexico, the usual mix for this route. Maria was preparing for the quick turnaround. The same aircraft would be departing for San Diego in just over an hour. As the last few passengers exited the jet bridge, Maria noticed a woman who seemed to be struggling with her carry-on bag. She was probably in her early 40s, wearing a beige pantsuit that looked expensive but somehow disheveled. Her dark hair was pulled back in what had probably been a neat bun hours earlier, but now strands were falling loose around her face. What struck Maria immediately was how pale the woman looked, almost gray, as if she hadn't seen sunlight in weeks. "Ma'am, do you need assistance with your bag?" Maria asked, approaching the woman. The woman looked up at Maria with eyes that seemed unfocused, almost glassy. I think I'm lost," she said in a voice barely above a whisper. Maria glanced at the woman's boarding pass, which she was clutching in her free hand. "You're in Phoenix, ma'am. This is your destination. Are you meeting someone here, or do you need directions to baggage claim?" "Phoenix?" The woman repeated the word as if she'd never heard it before. "But I was supposed to go to... I can't remember where I was supposed to go." Maria had dealt with confused passengers before. Elderly travelers with dementia, people on medication, exhausted business travelers who'd lost track of their itinerary. But something about this woman felt different. There was a quality to her confusion that seemed deeper than simple disorientation. "Let me help you figure this out," Maria said gently. "What's your name?" The woman stared at Maria for a long moment before answering. "Rebecca. Rebecca Morrison. I think. You think? Maria asked. I'm sorry, I'm just very tired. It's been a long trip. Maria looked at the boarding pass again. The name printed on it was indeed Rebecca Morrison, seat 12A, departing from Albuquerque. Everything seemed normal, but Maria couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Mrs. Morrison, do you remember why you were traveling to Phoenix? Business or pleasure? Rebecca Morrison looked down at her hands, which Maria noticed were trembling slightly. I was visiting someone important, but I can't. The details are fuzzy. As they talked, Maria became aware of a strange sound, a soft, rhythmic scraping noise that seemed to be coming from the woman's feet. Looking down, Maria saw that Rebecca was wearing black dress shoes that appeared to be covered in sand. With each small movement, grains of sand fell from her shoes onto the airport's polished floor. Mrs. Morrison, have you been to the beach recently? Maria asked, though she knew there were no beaches anywhere near Albuquerque. Rebecca looked down at her feet as if seeing the sand for the first time. I don't remember going to any beach. The sand wasn't just on her shoes, Maria realized. It was embedded in the cuffs of her pants, dusting the bottom of her carry-on bag, even caught in the strands of her hair that had come loose from her bun. It was as if Rebecca Morrison had been walking through sand for hours. Ma'am, I think you might want to sit down for a moment, Maria said, guiding Rebecca to a nearby chair in the gate area. Can I get you some water? Rebecca nodded gratefully and sank into the chair. As she did, more sand scattered from her clothing onto the floor. Maria went to the gate desk to get a bottle of water, but also to check something that had been nagging at her. Maria pulled up the passenger manifest for Flight 2847 on her computer. Rebecca Morrison was listed in seat 12A, just as her boarding pass indicated. But when Maria looked at the check-in details, something didn't make sense. According to the system, Rebecca Morrison had checked in for the flight at 3:17 p.m. in Albuquerque. But the flight hadn't even begun boarding until 11:30 p.m. due to the weather delays. Where had Rebecca Morrison been for over 8 hours between check-in and boarding? Maria returned to Rebecca with the water, but found her staring blankly at the window overlooking the tarmac. The woman seemed to be watching something in the distance, though Maria couldn't see anything unusual outside. Mrs. Morrison, here's some water. Are you feeling better? Rebecca turned to look at Maria, and for a moment, her eyes seemed clearer, more focused. You're very kind. I'm sorry for being such trouble. I just feel like I've been walking for such a long time. Walking where? Maria asked gently. Through the desert. Miles and miles of desert. But that doesn't make sense, does it? I was on a plane. Maria felt a chill run down her spine. Mrs. Morrison, do you remember boarding the flight in Albuquerque? Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, her brow furrowed in concentration. I remember being at the airport. But everything after that is like a dream. A very long, very hot dream. As Rebecca spoke, Maria noticed that the sand around her chair was forming a small pile. It wasn't just falling from her clothes anymore. It seemed to be materializing from nowhere, appearing on her shoulders, in her hair on her hands. The more Rebecca talked about walking through the desert, the more sand appeared. Mrs. Morrison, I think we should call someone for you. Do you have family in Phoenix? Someone who is expecting you? I I can't remember. Rebecca's voice was becoming fainter, more distant. But I think I was supposed to meet someone. Someone who was waiting for me. Maria was about to suggest calling medical services when her computer chimed with an incoming message. It was from the Albuquerque gate agent who had handled Flight 2847's departure. The message was brief but alarming. Need to speak with you about passenger Morrison. Call immediately. Maria excused herself and called the Albuquerque airport. The gate agent who answered, a man named Carlos Valdez, sounded shaken. Maria, thank God you called. I need to ask you about Rebecca Morrison. Did she make it to Phoenix? She's here now, but Carlos, something's wrong with her. She seems confused, disoriented, and she's covered in sand. What happened in Albuquerque? There was a long pause before Carlos answered. Maria, Rebecca Morrison never boarded that flight. What do you mean? She's sitting right here with a valid boarding pass. I mean, she never got on the plane. She checked in at 3:17 p.m. like your system shows, but she never showed up at the gate. We called her name multiple times during boarding, but she was a no-show. Her seat was empty when we departed. Maria felt the blood drain from her face. Carlos, that's impossible. She's here. She has her boarding pass. She deplaned with the other passengers. Maria, I'm looking at the security footage right now. Rebecca Morrison's seat, 12A, was empty for the entire flight. No one sat there. Maria looked back at Rebecca, who was still sitting in the chair, more sand somehow accumulating around her feet. Carlos, if she didn't board in Albuquerque, how did she get to Phoenix? I don't know. But Maria, there's something else. We found Rebecca Morrison's car in our long-term parking lot. It's been there since yesterday afternoon. But here's the thing. The car is completely buried in sand. Not just dusty, but buried like it's been sitting in the desert for months. Maria's hands were shaking as she hung up the phone. She walked back to Rebecca, trying to process what she'd just learned. If Rebecca Morrison hadn't boarded the flight in Albuquerque, if her seat had been empty for the entire journey, then how was she here? And how had she gotten a boarding pass for a flight she never took? Mrs. Morrison, Maria said carefully, I need to ask you something. Are you sure you were on that flight from Albuquerque? Rebecca looked up at Maria with those glassy, unfocused eyes. I think so. But the more I try to remember, the less certain I become. I remember walking. So much walking. Through sand and heat and emptiness. Where were you walking to? Here, Rebecca said simply. I was walking here. To Phoenix. To catch my flight. But Mrs. Morrison, you were supposed to be flying from Albuquerque to Phoenix, not walking. Rebecca stood up suddenly, sand cascading from her clothes like a small waterfall. I missed my flight, didn't I? I was supposed to be on a plane, but I missed it, so I had to walk. Mrs. Morrison, you can't walk from Albuquerque to Phoenix. It's over 200 miles through the desert. But I did walk, Rebecca said, her voice becoming more agitated. I walked and walked and walked, through the night and through the day and through another night. I couldn't stop walking because I had to catch my flight. Maria watched in horror as more sand began pouring from Rebecca's hair, her pockets, even from her mouth as she spoke. The woman was becoming a human sandstorm, leaving a trail of desert sand across the pristine airport floor. "I have to go now," Rebecca said, picking up her carry-on bag. "I have to catch my connecting flight." "Mrs. Morrison, wait. You don't have a connecting flight. Phoenix was your destination." But Rebecca was already walking away, heading toward the main terminal. With each step, she left footprints of sand, and Maria could hear that soft, scraping sound getting fainter as the woman disappeared into the crowd of late-night travelers. Maria immediately called airport security and gave them Rebecca's description. But when they reviewed the security cameras, they found something impossible. The cameras showed Maria talking to an empty chair. The footage clearly showed Maria handing a bottle of water to no one, having a conversation with thin air, and looking concerned about something that wasn't there. But the sand was real. The maintenance crew had to bring in special equipment to clean up the pile of desert sand that had accumulated around the chair where Rebecca Morrison had been sitting. The sand was tested and found to contain minerals and plant matter consistent with the Sonoran Desert between Albuquerque and Phoenix. The investigation that followed revealed more disturbing details. Rebecca Morrison had indeed checked in for Flight 2847 in Albuquerque, but the security footage showed her leaving the airport shortly after check-in. Her cell phone's GPS data showed her driving into the desert east of Albuquerque, where the signal was lost around 4:30 p.m. Search and rescue teams found Rebecca Morrison's body 3 days later, approximately 50 miles into the desert between Albuquerque and Phoenix. She had died of dehydration and exposure, and the medical examiner estimated that death had occurred roughly 36 hours before Maria encountered her at the Phoenix airport. Rebecca Morrison had indeed tried to walk from Albuquerque to Phoenix. Her car had run out of gas on a remote desert road, and instead of waiting for help, she had apparently decided to walk to her destination. She had made it about a quarter of the way before the desert claimed her life. But somehow, some part of Rebecca Morrison had completed the journey. She had walked through death itself to catch her flight, arriving at Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport as a passenger who had never boarded, carrying the sand of her final journey in her shoes and in her hair. Maria requested a transfer to day shifts after that night. She couldn't explain what she had experienced, and the security footage made her question her own sanity. But she knew what she had seen, what she had heard, and what she had felt when she handed that bottle of water to a woman who had been dead for over a day. The gate area at A7 was deep cleaned and renovated after the incident, but maintenance workers still occasionally find small piles of sand near the chairs where passengers wait for their flights. And sometimes, late at night, gate agents report seeing a woman in a beige pantsuit walking through the terminal, always heading toward the departure gates, always carrying a boarding pass for a flight she'll never catch. Rebecca Morrison's determination to reach her destination had been stronger than death itself. She had walked through the desert, through the boundary between life and death, and through the impossible, driven by the simple human need to complete her journey. The official report classified the incident as a passenger service irregularity and was filed away in a database that few people have access to. But Maria Santos knows that sometimes the desire to reach our destination is so powerful that not even death can stop us from trying to catch our flight. And in the desert between Albuquerque and Phoenix, if you know where to look, you can still see the footprints Rebecca Morrison left in the sand. Footprints that lead not to her final resting place, but to Gate 07 at Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport, where a woman with sand in her shoes is still trying to catch her connecting flight. Let's move to our fourth story. Jake Thompson had been working airport security at Chicago O'Hare for 9 years, and he thought he knew every inch of Terminal 3. The night shift from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. was his domain. Monitoring security cameras, conducting random patrols, and ensuring that one of the world's busiest airports remained safe during the quiet hours when most travelers were either sleeping or catching red-eye flights. It was 3:22 a.m. on a Thursday in December when Jake first noticed something unusual on camera 47, which monitored the long corridor leading to gates K1 through K8. The terminal was nearly empty at this hour, with only a few passengers scattered throughout the gate areas waiting for early morning departures. But on his monitor, Jake could see a figure walking slowly down the corridor, someone wearing a dark hooded sweatshirt that obscured their face completely. What caught Jake's attention wasn't just the late hour or the concealing clothing. It was the way the person moved. They walked with perfect knowledge of where every security camera was positioned, staying just at the edge of each camera's field of view, never allowing their face to be captured clearly. This wasn't the behavior of a normal passenger. This was someone who had studied the airport's security layout extensively. Jake switched between different camera angles, trying to get a better view of the hooded figure. But no matter which camera he used, the person seemed to anticipate exactly where the blind spots were. They moved through the terminal like a ghost, visible but never identifiable, always staying just out of clear sight. "Control, this is Thompson." Jake radioed to the main security office. "I've got a suspicious individual in Terminal 3, Concourse K. Someone who knows our camera positions way too well." "Copy that, Thompson. Can you get a visual description?" "Negative. They're wearing a hood and staying in the camera blind spots. But whoever this is has intimate knowledge of our security setup." Jake left his monitoring station and began walking toward Concourse K, keeping his radio ready. The terminal felt different at this hour. The usual bustle of daytime travel replaced by an eerie quiet, broken only by the hum of air conditioning and the distant sound of cleaning equipment. His footsteps echoed in the empty corridors as he made his way toward where he'd last seen the hooded figure. When Jake reached the K concourse, it appeared completely empty. He walked the entire length of the corridor, checking every gate area, every restroom, every alcove where someone might hide. Nothing. The hooded figure had vanished as mysteriously as they had appeared. Jake was about to return to his station when he noticed something that made his blood run cold. On the floor near gate K4, there were wet footprints leading from the corridor toward the gate's seating area. But it hadn't been raining, and the terminal's floors were dry everywhere else. Following the wet prints, Jake discovered they led directly to gate K4's boarding area, and then stopped abruptly at the windows overlooking the tarmac. The prints were clear and distinct, the outline of work boots, size 11 or 12. But they ended at the window, as if whoever had been walking had simply walked through the glass and disappeared onto the tarmac below. Jake looked out the window at the tarmac. Gate K4 was currently empty. No aircraft was scheduled to arrive or depart until 6:15 a.m. The area below was well lit by floodlights, and Jake could see the entire space clearly. There was no one there. "Control, I need you to review camera 47 from the last 10 minutes. The hooded individual, where did they go?" "Thompson, I'm looking at the footage now. That's impossible." "What's impossible?" "The person you were tracking. They're not showing up on any of our cameras now. I can see you walking through the concourse, but there's no one else visible in any of the footage." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. "Control, I'm looking at wet footprints right now. Someone was definitely here." "Thompson, I believe you, but I'm telling you, our cameras show no one in that area except you. Jake took photos of the footprints with his phone and continued his search. He checked every possible hiding place in the K concourse, but found nothing. The hooded figure had simply vanished, leaving only wet footprints that led to nowhere. It was when Jake was walking back toward his station that he encountered the cleaning crew supervisor, Elena Vasquez, who was working the overnight shift. "Jake, did you see someone in a hoodie about 20 minutes ago?" Elena asked. "One of my crew members, Carlos, said he saw someone suspicious near the K gates." "Where's Carlos now?" "I need to talk to him." Elena looked confused. "That's the thing. I can't find him. He was supposed to be cleaning the K concourse, but he's not responding to his radio." Jake and Elena searched for Carlos throughout Terminal 3. They found his cleaning cart abandoned near Gate K6, with his radio lying on the floor beside it. Carlos's jacket was draped over the cart, but there was no sign of the man himself. "Elena, how long has Carlos worked here?" Jake asked. "About 3 years. He's one of our most reliable people, never misses a shift, never abandons his equipment. This isn't like him at all." Jake called for additional security personnel to help search for Carlos. Within 30 minutes, they had 6 officers combing through every area of Terminal 3. They checked security offices, maintenance rooms, storage areas, even the restricted zones that required special clearance. Carlos Mendoza had simply disappeared. It was Officer Patricia Williams who made the discovery that changed everything. While reviewing security footage from earlier in the evening, she found something that made Jake's encounter even more disturbing. "Jake, you need to see this," Patricia said, calling him over to her monitor. "This is footage from camera 23, taken at 11:47 p.m., about 4 hours before you saw your hooded figure." The footage showed Carlos Mendoza cleaning near Gate K3. He was working normally, emptying trash cans and mopping the floor. But at 11:52 p.m., Carlos suddenly stopped what he was doing and looked toward the camera with an expression of terror on his face. He appeared to be staring at something just outside the camera's field of view. "Watch what happens next," Patricia said. On the screen, Carlos dropped his mop and began backing away from whatever he was looking at. His mouth was open as if he was screaming, but the security cameras didn't record audio. Carlos continued backing away until he was out of the camera's range. "That's the last footage we have of Carlos," Patricia said. "But watch this." She switched to camera 47, the same camera Jake had been monitoring when he first saw the hooded figure. The timestamp showed 11:54 p.m., just 2 minutes after Carlos had disappeared from camera 23. On the monitor, Jake could see the hooded figure walking down the K concourse corridor. But now, knowing what to look for, Jake noticed something he had missed before. The figure wasn't just avoiding the cameras. They were walking in exactly the same pattern Carlos had been using for his cleaning route. "Patricia, can you enhance the image? I want to see the figure's hands." Patricia zoomed in on the hooded figure's hands. What they saw made both officers step back from the monitor. The figure was carrying a mop. "Jesus Christ," Jake whispered. "That's not some random intruder, that's Carlos." But if the hooded figure was Carlos, why had he been avoiding the cameras? Why had he appeared terrified in the earlier footage? And most importantly, where was he now? Jake returned to Gate K4, where he had found the wet footprints. This time, he examined them more carefully with his flashlight. The prints weren't just wet. They had a reddish tinge to them, as if the water was mixed with something else. Using a cotton swab from his first aid kit, Jake collected a sample of the liquid from one of the footprints. Under his flashlight, it was clearly visible that the liquid was blood mixed with water. "Control, I need a hazmat team at Gate K4 immediately. And I need you to lock down Terminal 3. No one enters or leaves until we figure out what happened here." The hazmat team arrived within 20 minutes and confirmed Jake's suspicion. The footprints contained human blood. DNA analysis would later confirm that the blood belonged to Carlos Mendoza. But Carlos was never found. The investigation revealed that Carlos had been working alone in the K concourse when something had frightened him badly enough to abandon his equipment and flee. Security footage showed him backing away from an unseen threat, and then he had simply vanished. The hooded figure that Jake had observed was indeed Carlos, but something had happened to him between 11:52 p.m. when he was seen fleeing in terror, and 11:54 p.m. when he appeared on camera wearing a hood and carrying his mop. Something that had changed him, made him avoid the security cameras he had never paid attention to before, and ultimately led to his disappearance. The wet, bloody footprints suggested that Carlos had been injured, but there was no trail of blood leading away from Gate K4. The prints simply ended at the window, as if Carlos had walked through the glass and vanished into the night. Jake requested a transfer to day shift after that incident. He couldn't explain what had happened to Carlos Mendoza, but he knew that something in Terminal 3's K concourse had the power to make people disappear. The official report listed Carlos as a missing person, but Jake suspected the truth was far more sinister. Terminal 3's K concourse was temporarily closed for maintenance after the incident. When it reopened 2 weeks later, additional security cameras had been installed, eliminating most of the blind spots that the hooded figure had used to avoid detection. But sometimes, during the overnight shift, security officers still report seeing a figure in a dark hoodie walking through the K concourse, carrying a mop and staying just out of clear camera range. The figure never approaches passengers or interferes with airport operations. It simply walks the same cleaning route over and over, as if trapped in an endless loop of the final task it was performing, before whatever happened at Gate K4 claimed it forever. Carlos Mendoza's cleaning cart still sits in a storage room at O'Hare, waiting for him to return to finish his shift. But Jake Thompson knows that some shifts never end, and some workers never get to go home. Let's move to our fifth story. Tommy Nguyen had been working night maintenance at LAX for 4 years, specializing in aircraft interior cleaning and minor repairs. The job paid well, especially with the overnight differential. And Tommy appreciated the solitude that came with working while the rest of the world slept. He was methodical in his work, taking pride in ensuring that every aircraft was spotless and ready for the next day's passengers. It was 2:15 a.m. on a foggy October night when Tommy received his assignment: deep clean the interior of a Boeing 767 that had just completed a transatlantic flight from London. The aircraft, registration N456AA, was parked at Gate 52 in Terminal 4, isolated from the main passenger areas. Tommy had cleaned this particular plane before. It was part of American Airlines' regular London-Los Angeles route, and he knew its layout intimately. Tommy entered the aircraft through the main cabin door, wheeling his cleaning cart behind him. The 767 was configured with 28 business class seats and 160 economy seats, spread across a single-aisle layout. The cabin was dimly lit by emergency lighting, casting long shadows between the rows of seats. Tommy began his routine at the front of the aircraft, working his way methodically toward the rear. Everything seemed normal as Tommy cleaned the business class section. He vacuumed the carpets, wiped down the seats, cleaned the windows, and restocked the seatback pockets with fresh magazines and safety cards. The work was routine, almost meditative, and Tommy found himself settling into the familiar rhythm of his tasks. It was when he reached row 15 in the economy section that Tommy first heard it. A soft, rhythmic breathing sound coming from somewhere behind him. He stopped his vacuum cleaner and listened carefully. The breathing was slow and steady, like someone in deep sleep. But there was something labored about it, as if the person was struggling for air. Tommy turned around, expecting to see a passenger who had somehow been missed during deplaning. But the rows behind him were empty, the seats all in their upright positions with no sign of occupancy. He called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" but received no response. Assuming he had imagined the sound, Tommy resumed his cleaning. But within minutes, the breathing returned, clearer and more distinct than before. It seemed to be coming from directly behind him, no more than a few feet away. Tommy spun around quickly, but again found nothing but empty seats. The breathing continued even as Tommy stood perfectly still, listening. It was definitely human. The unmistakable sound of someone drawing air into their lungs and exhaling slowly. But the rhythm was wrong somehow. Too slow and too deep, as if whoever was breathing was doing so with great effort. Tommy decided to investigate systematically. He walked through every row of the aircraft, checking under seats, in overhead bins, even in the lavatories. The plane was completely empty except for him. But as soon as he returned to his cleaning, the breathing resumed, always seeming to come from just behind his current position. "This is ridiculous," Tommy muttered to himself, trying to rationalize what he was hearing. Aircraft ventilation systems could make strange noises, especially older planes like this 767. The breathing was probably just air moving through the ducts in an unusual way. But as Tommy continued his work, the breathing became more pronounced. He could hear not just the inhalation and exhalation, but also subtle variations in the rhythm, sometimes faster, sometimes slower, sometimes with a slight wheeze or catch. These weren't the sounds of an air conditioning system. These were the breathing patterns of a living person. Tommy was cleaning row 23 when the breathing suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was somehow more unnerving than the sound had been. Tommy waited, listening intently, but heard nothing except the distant hum of the aircraft's auxiliary power unit. Then, just as Tommy was about to resume his work, he heard something that made his blood run cold. A voice, barely above a whisper, coming from directly behind him. "Excuse me." Tommy spun around so quickly that he knocked over his cleaning supplies. Standing in the aisle behind him was a man in his 60s, wearing a rumpled business suit and looking extremely pale. The man's eyes were bloodshot, and his breathing was visibly labored, his chest rising and falling with obvious effort. "Sir, you can't be here," Tommy said, his heart racing. "This aircraft is out of service." "How did you get on board?" The man looked at Tommy with confusion in his eyes. I was sleeping. I think I missed my stop." "Your stop?" "Sir, this is an airplane, not a bus." "What's your name? Do you have a boarding pass?" The man reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a crumpled boarding pass. Tommy took it and examined it under his flashlight. The pass was for American Airlines Flight 136 from London to Los Angeles, seat 23C. The date on the pass was from 3 days ago. Sir, this flight landed 3 days ago. You couldn't have been sleeping here for 3 days. The man looked around the cabin, as if seeing it for the first time. 3 days? That's impossible. I just closed my eyes for a moment during the meal service. Tommy noticed that the man's skin had an unhealthy gray pallor, and his breathing was becoming more labored by the minute. Sir, are you feeling all right? Do you need medical attention? I'm just very tired, the man said. I've been having trouble breathing lately. The doctor said it was pneumonia, but I thought I was getting better. Tommy's maintenance training included basic first aid, and he could see that this man was in serious distress. His lips had a bluish tinge, and he was struggling to get enough air. Sir, I'm going to call for medical help. What's your name? Harold Brennan. But I don't understand how I could have been sleeping for 3 days. I remember the flight attendant serving dinner, and then I felt so tired. Tommy was reaching for his radio when Harold Brennan suddenly collapsed into seat 23C, the same seat listed on his boarding pass. The man's breathing became even more labored, and Tommy could see that he was in severe respiratory distress. Control. This is Nguyen in aircraft N456AA at gate 52. I need paramedics immediately. I have a passenger in medical distress. Tommy, what passenger? That aircraft was cleared hours ago. There's a man here, Harold Brennan. He says he was on the flight from London 3 days ago, but he's been sleeping on the plane since then. Tommy knelt beside Harold, who was now struggling to breathe. The man's eyes were wide with panic, and he was gasping for air like a fish out of water. Help me, Harold whispered. I can't breathe. The paramedics are coming, Tommy assured him, though he wondered how long it would take them to reach the remote gate. Harold grabbed Tommy's arm with surprising strength. I was supposed to see my daughter, he gasped. In Los Angeles. She's getting married next week. I can't miss her wedding. You're going to be fine, Tommy said, though Harold's condition was clearly deteriorating rapidly. I've been trying to get off this plane for days, Harold continued, his voice becoming weaker. But every time I try to leave, I end up back in my seat. I can't seem to find the exit. Tommy looked toward the front of the aircraft, where the main cabin door was clearly visible and still open from when he had entered. Sir, the exit is right there. You can see it from here. Harold followed Tommy's gaze, but his expression remained confused. I don't see anything. Just darkness. The paramedics arrived 15 minutes later, but by then, Harold Brennan had stopped breathing entirely. They worked on him for nearly an hour, trying to resuscitate him, but it was too late. Harold was pronounced dead at 3:47 a.m. The investigation that followed revealed disturbing details about Harold Brennan's story. He had indeed been a passenger on Flight 136 from London 3 days earlier, traveling to Los Angeles to attend his daughter's wedding. According to the flight manifest, he had been assigned to seat 23C, exactly where Tommy had found him. But according to the flight crew and other passengers, Harold Brennan had died during the flight. He had been suffering from severe pneumonia and had gone into respiratory failure somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean. The flight attendants had moved his body to an empty row and covered it with blankets, following standard procedure for in-flight deaths. Upon landing in Los Angeles, Harold's body had been removed by the coroner's office and transported to a local funeral home. His daughter had been notified, and funeral arrangements had been made. Harold Brennan had been officially dead for 3 days when Tommy encountered him on the aircraft. The coroner confirmed that the man Tommy had spoken with was indeed Harold Brennan, but the body showed signs of decomposition consistent with having been dead for 72 hours. There was no medical explanation for how a dead man could have been walking, talking, and breathing on that aircraft. Tommy requested a transfer to day shift maintenance after the incident. He couldn't explain what he had experienced, but he knew that Harold Brennan had somehow remained on Flight 136 long after his body had been removed. The man's determination to reach his daughter's wedding had been stronger than death itself. The Boeing 767 was taken out of service for a complete inspection and deep cleaning. When it returned to the London-Los Angeles route 2 weeks later, flight attendants reported that Seat 23C seemed to have persistent air conditioning problems. Passengers complained that it was always too cold, and many requested to be moved to different seats. Tommy never worked on that particular aircraft again, but he heard from other maintenance workers that they sometimes found Seat 23C in the reclined position even after the aircraft had been properly configured for the next flight. And occasionally, during overnight cleaning, workers reported hearing labored breathing coming from the empty seat, as if someone was still struggling to take their final breath. Harold Brennan never made it to his daughter's wedding, but part of him remained on Flight 136, forever trying to complete his journey to Los Angeles. His breathing could still be heard in the quiet hours of the night, a reminder that some passengers never truly deplane, and some flights never really end. Let's move to our 6th story. Kevin Lawson had been planning this moment for 18 months. Every detail had been meticulously calculated, every contingency accounted for, every security measure studied and overcome. As he walked through the employee entrance at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport at 11:43 p.m., his maintenance uniform crisp and his forged credentials perfect, Kevin felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that had sustained him through months of preparation. The night shift supervisor, Janet Mills, barely looked up from her paperwork as Kevin badged in. "You're the new guy from Houston, right? Kevin?" "That's right, I'm ready to get started." Aircraft 447 in Hangar 12. Routine maintenance check. Should be straightforward for your first night. Kevin nodded and collected his toolkit. But the tools inside weren't standard maintenance equipment. Hidden beneath the legitimate wrenches and screwdrivers were devices that would turn American Airlines Flight 2156 into a flying coffin. Kevin had spent 2 years learning aircraft systems, studying blueprints, and identifying the exact points where a few small modifications could cause catastrophic failure at 35,000 feet. The Boeing 737 sat in the dimly lit hangar like a sleeping giant. Kevin approached it with the reverence of someone who understood exactly how much destruction this machine could cause in the right hands. Or rather, the wrong hands. Kevin's plan was elegant in its simplicity. 3 small devices, each no larger than a smartphone, would be installed in critical systems. The first would interfere with the aircraft's hydraulic controls, making it impossible to maintain stable flight. The second would disable the emergency oxygen system, ensuring that passengers would lose consciousness before they could understand what was happening. The third would jam all communication systems, preventing the pilots from calling for help. The beauty of Kevin's plan was that the devices would activate only after the aircraft reached cruising altitude. The takeoff would be normal, the initial climb would proceed without incident, and then, when the plane was at its most vulnerable point, high above the earth with nowhere to land, the systems would begin to fail in a cascade of malfunctions that would appear to be random mechanical failures. Kevin had chosen Flight 2156 specifically because it was a morning departure to New York, typically carrying business travelers and families. The passenger manifest showed 147 souls on board, including crew. It would be Kevin's largest statement yet, his masterpiece of destruction that would finally force the world to pay attention to his message. As Kevin worked beneath the aircraft, installing the first device in the hydraulic bay, he reflected on the path that had brought him here. The airline industry had destroyed his life, cost him his job, his marriage, his children. When he'd been fired from his maintenance position at Southwest Airlines for attitude problems, Kevin had sworn revenge against the entire industry. If they wanted to treat him like he was dangerous, he would show them what dangerous really looked like. The first device installed perfectly, its magnetic housing attaching securely to the hydraulic line. Kevin moved to the second location, near the emergency oxygen system. This device was more complex, requiring him to splice into the aircraft's electrical system. As he worked, Kevin imagined the chaos that would unfold tomorrow morning when Flight 2156 encountered its first malfunction. It was while Kevin was installing the third device in the communication bay that he first sensed he wasn't alone. The hangar was supposed to be empty except for him. The night shift was deliberately understaffed to give Kevin the privacy he needed for his work. But as he crouched beneath the aircraft's belly, Kevin heard footsteps echoing in the vast space above him. Kevin froze, listening carefully. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, moving around the aircraft in a pattern that suggested someone was conducting an inspection. Kevin's heart began to race. If he was discovered now, 18 months of planning would be wasted. Worse, he would be arrested before he could complete his mission. The footsteps stopped directly above Kevin's position. He could hear someone moving around on the aircraft's upper surface, near the cockpit area. Kevin waited, barely breathing, for the person to move away. But the sounds continued. Not just footsteps now, but the distinct noise of someone working on the aircraft. Kevin carefully extracted himself from beneath the plane and looked up at the cockpit area. What he saw made his blood run cold. A figure in maintenance coveralls was crouched near the aircraft's nose, working on something with tools that glinted in the hangar's fluorescent lighting. But the figure's movements were wrong somehow. Too fluid, too precise, almost mechanical in their efficiency. "Hey," Kevin called out. "What are you doing up there?" The figure stopped working but didn't look up. For a long moment, there was complete silence in the hangar. Then, without turning around, the figure spoke in a voice that was barely audible. "The same thing you're doing." Kevin felt a chill run down his spine. "I don't know what you mean. I'm just doing routine maintenance." The figure finally turned around, and Kevin saw a face that was disturbingly familiar. It was his own face, but older, more weathered, with eyes that held a depth of exhaustion and regret that Kevin had never seen in any mirror. "No, Kevin," the figure said, climbing down from the aircraft with movements that seemed to flow like water. "You're sabotaging this plane, just like I did." Kevin backed away, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. "That's impossible. You can't be me." "I'm you from tomorrow night," the figure said, approaching Kevin with slow, deliberate steps. "I'm you after Flight 2156 crashes, after 147 people die because of what you're doing right now. "You're not real," Kevin said. But even as he spoke the words, he could see details that made the figure's claim terrifyingly plausible. The older Kevin wore the same maintenance uniform, carried the same tools, even had the same scar on his left hand from a childhood accident. "I'm as real as the guilt that's going to consume you," the older Kevin said. "I'm as real as the nightmares you'll have every night for the rest of your life. I'm as real as the moment you'll realize that those 147 people had families, dreams, futures that you stole from them." "They deserve it," Kevin said, but his voice lacked conviction. "The airline industry destroyed my life." "No, Kevin, you destroyed your own life. And now you're about to destroy 147 others." The older Kevin reached into his toolkit and pulled out devices identical to the ones Kevin had been installing. "I came back to stop you from making the same mistake I made." Kevin watched in horror as his older self began removing the sabotage devices from the aircraft. "You can't do that. This is my mission, my revenge." "Your revenge?" The older Kevin laughed bitterly. "Kevin, do you know what happened after Flight 2156 crashed? Do you know what your revenge actually accomplished?" Kevin didn't answer, but the older version continued. "Nothing. Absolutely nothing. The airline industry didn't change. Security didn't improve. The only thing that happened was that 147 innocent people died, and you spent the rest of your life knowing you were a mass murderer." "I won't get caught," Kevin said weakly. "Oh, but you will. Because one of the passengers on Flight 2156 is going to be Sarah Chen, an 8-year-old girl traveling to New York to see her grandmother. And when her body is pulled from the wreckage, when you see her picture on the news, when you realize that you killed a child who had never done anything to hurt anyone, you're going to confess." The older Kevin had removed all 3 devices now and was holding them in his hands. "You're going to turn yourself in because the guilt will be unbearable. And you're going to spend the rest of your life in prison, knowing that you threw away everything, your freedom, your sanity, your soul, for a revenge that accomplished nothing." Kevin stared at the devices in his older self's hands. "If you're really me from the future, then you know I won't listen. You know I'll just install new devices." "No, Kevin, because I'm not just here to remove these devices. I'm here to remove you." The older Kevin's expression changed, becoming something cold and determined that Kevin had never seen in his own reflection. "You see, Kevin, there's only one way to prevent Flight 2156 from crashing. Only one way to save those 147 lives." Kevin began backing toward the hangar exit, but found his path blocked by security guards who seemed to have materialized from nowhere. "Kevin Lawson," one of them said, "you're under arrest for attempted sabotage of a commercial aircraft." As the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, Kevin looked back at his older self, who was now fading like smoke in the hangar's fluorescent lighting. "How?" Kevin asked. "I called them," the older Kevin said, his voice becoming fainter. "I told them exactly when and where to find you. It was the only way to stop you from becoming me." Kevin was led away in handcuffs, his 18 months of planning destroyed in a single night. Flight 2156 departed on schedule the next morning, carrying 147 passengers safely to New York. Among them was 8-year-old Sarah Chen, who spent the flight drawing pictures of airplanes and dreaming of becoming a pilot when she grew up. Kevin Lawson was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for attempted terrorism. During his trial, he claimed that he had been stopped by a future version of himself. But the court dismissed this as an obvious attempt at an insanity defense. The official record showed that Kevin had been caught by an anonymous tip called in to airport security. But sometimes, late at night in his prison cell, Kevin can still see his older self standing in the shadows, a reminder of the monster he almost became, and the lives he almost destroyed. The older Kevin serves as a guardian, ensuring that the timeline where Flight 2156 crashes never comes to pass. And in Hangar 12 at DFW Airport, maintenance workers sometimes report seeing a figure in coveralls inspecting aircraft during the night shift, always checking the same systems, always ensuring that no one else tries to turn a routine flight into a tragedy. The figure never interferes with legitimate maintenance work. But any attempt at sabotage is met with swift intervention from security forces who seem to know exactly when and where to look. Kevin Lawson's future self remains vigilant, forever preventing the past that created him, trapped in a paradox of redemption that can never truly end. Let's move to our seventh story. Captain Michael Torres had been flying commercial aircraft for 22 years, and he thought he'd encountered every possible emergency scenario during his career. From engine failures to severe weather, from medical emergencies to unruly passengers, Torres had handled it all with the calm professionalism that had earned him a reputation as one of United Airlines' most reliable pilots. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for what happened on Flight 891 during a routine red-eye from Seattle to Denver. It was 2:47 a.m. when Torres and his co-pilot, First Officer Lisa Park, were cruising at 37,000 feet over the Rocky Mountains. The Boeing 757 was carrying 189 passengers, most of whom were sleeping peacefully in the darkened cabin. The flight had been unremarkable so far. Smooth air, clear weather, and all systems operating normally. Torres was reviewing the approach procedures for Denver when the first warning light appeared on his instrument panel. It was the hydraulic system indicator, showing a pressure drop in the primary hydraulic circuit. Torres frowned and checked the secondary systems, but they were all showing normal readings. "Lisa, are you seeing this hydraulic warning?" Torres asked his co-pilot. Park leaned over to examine the display. Primary hydraulic pressure is dropping, but backup systems are nominal. Could be a sensor malfunction. Torres was about to call the maintenance control when a second warning light illuminated, this time indicating a problem with the aircraft's electrical system. Then, a third light appeared, showing an issue with the environmental control system. Within 30 seconds, Torres's instrument panel looked like a Christmas tree, with warning lights flashing across every major aircraft system. "This doesn't make sense," Park said, her voice tight with concern. "We can't have simultaneous failures in unrelated systems." Torres began running through emergency checklists. But before he could complete the first procedure, something happened that made his blood run cold. Every single warning light on the instrument panel went dark simultaneously. And then the aircraft's primary electrical system shut down completely. The cockpit was plunged into darkness except for the dim glow of battery-powered emergency lighting. The constant hum of electrical systems that had been the background soundtrack of their flight suddenly ceased, leaving an eerie silence broken only by the sound of wind rushing past the aircraft. "We've lost primary electrical," Torres announced, his training keeping his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "Switching to emergency power." But when Torres tried to activate the emergency electrical system, nothing happened. The backup generators that should have automatically engaged remained silent. The aircraft was flying on momentum alone, with no electrical power to operate critical systems like flight controls, navigation, or communication equipment. "Mike, this is impossible," Park said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We can't lose primary and backup electrical simultaneously. The systems are completely independent." Torres tried the radio, but it was dead. He attempted to activate the transponder to signal their emergency to air traffic control, but that system was also non-responsive. Flight 891 had become a ghost ship in the sky, invisible to radar and unable to communicate with the ground. It was then that Torres noticed something that made the situation even more terrifying. The aircraft's flight management computer, which should have been completely dead without electrical power, was displaying a message that chilled him to the bone. "Manual override activated. External control engaged." "Lisa, look at the FMC," Torres said, pointing to the display. Park stared at the impossible message. "That can't be right. The FMC can't display anything without main electrical power. And what does external control mean?" Before Torres could respond, the aircraft began to bank sharply to the left, despite the fact that neither pilot was touching the controls. Torres grabbed the yoke and tried to level the aircraft, but the controls felt sluggish and unresponsive, as if someone else was fighting him for control of the plane. "I'm not doing this," Torres said through gritted teeth, pulling hard on the yoke. "Someone else is flying this aircraft." The plane continued its uncommanded turn, and Torres could feel the aircraft beginning to descend. Without electrical power, he had no way to check their altitude or airspeed. But he could sense from the changing air pressure that they were losing height rapidly. Park was frantically checking circuit breakers, looking for any way to restore electrical power. "Mike, every single circuit breaker has been pulled. Every one. Someone manually disabled every electrical system on this aircraft." Torres felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold air rushing through the unpressurized cabin. "That's impossible. The circuit breaker panel is right here in the cockpit. No one could have accessed it without us seeing them." But as Park continued her inspection, the evidence was undeniable. Every circuit breaker that controlled electrical power to the aircraft had been systematically pulled, as if someone with intimate knowledge of the Boeing 757's electrical systems had methodically disabled every critical component. "Lisa, start pushing breakers back in. We need to get some power restored before we lose too much altitude." Park began resetting circuit breakers, but as soon as she pushed one in, it would pop back out again, as if invisible hands were pulling them out faster than she could reset them. The aircraft continued its descent, and Torres could hear the wind noise increasing as their airspeed built up. "This is insane," Park said, her voice cracking with stress. "The breakers won't stay in. It's like someone is actively fighting me." Torres tried the emergency procedures for manual flight control, but without hydraulic power, the aircraft was becoming increasingly difficult to control. The nose was dropping despite his efforts to maintain level flight, and he could feel the plane entering what pilots call a death spiral, a descending turn that would eventually become unrecoverable. It was then that Torres heard something that made his heart stop. From somewhere behind them in the cockpit came the sound of someone breathing. Slow, deliberate breathing, as if someone was standing directly behind the pilot's seats, watching their struggle. "Do you hear that?" Torres whispered to Park. Park stopped her frantic work with the circuit breakers and listened. The breathing was unmistakable. The sound of someone drawing air into their lungs and exhaling slowly, rhythmically. But when both pilots turned around to look, the cockpit behind them was empty. "There's no one there," Park said, but her voice was shaking. The breathing continued, and now Torres could hear something else. The faint sound of fingers moving across switches and controls, as if invisible hands were operating the aircraft systems. The sound was coming from the overhead panel, where the electrical controls were located. Torres looked up at the overhead panel and saw something that defied all logic. The switches were moving by themselves, flipping from one position to another with deliberate precision. Someone, or something, was systematically shutting down every remaining system on the aircraft. "We're going to die," Park said, her professional composure finally cracking. "Someone is trying to crash this plane, and we can't stop them." Torres refused to give up. Drawing on 2 decades of flying experience, he began using every technique he knew for manual flight control. Without electrical power, he had to rely on pure pilot skill and the aircraft's basic aerodynamic properties to maintain some semblance of controlled flight. "Lisa, forget the electrical systems. Help me with the controls. We're going to fly this thing manually." Working together, Torres and Park managed to arrest the aircraft's descent and bring it back to something approaching level flight. But they were still flying blind, with no way to navigate or communicate with air traffic control. They were somewhere over the Colorado Rockies in the middle of the night, flying a crippled aircraft by feel alone. The breathing behind them had stopped, but Torres could still sense a presence in the cockpit. It felt malevolent, patient, as if whatever was controlling their aircraft was simply waiting for them to make a mistake. For the next hour, Torres and Park fought to keep Flight 891 in the air. They used the stars for navigation, estimated their position based on flight time and heading, and prayed that they could find an airport before their fuel ran out. The passengers in the cabin were unaware of the drama unfolding in the cockpit, sleeping peacefully while their pilots battled for their lives. At 4:23 a.m., Torres saw the lights of Denver International Airport in the distance. Using every skill he possessed, he managed to line up the aircraft with runway 34R and execute a landing that would later be called miraculous by aviation experts. Flight 891 touched down safely, and 189 passengers and crew walked away from what should have been a fatal crash. The investigation that followed revealed disturbing evidence. Every circuit breaker in the cockpit had indeed been pulled, but security footage showed that no one had entered the cockpit during the flight except Torres and Park. The aircraft's maintenance logs showed no history of electrical problems, and ground tests after the incident showed all systems functioning normally. Most puzzling of all was the discovery of fingerprints on the circuit breaker panel. Fingerprints that didn't match Torres, Park, or any member of the maintenance crew. The prints belonged to someone who had died in an aircraft accident 15 years earlier, a pilot named David Chen who had been killed when his plane crashed in the same area of the Colorado Rockies where Flight 891 had experienced its electrical failures. Torres requested early retirement after the incident, unable to explain what had happened in the cockpit that night. The official report attributed the electrical failures to unknown causes and recommended additional training for pilots on manual flight procedures. But Torres knows what really happened on Flight 891. Someone, or something, had tried to crash his aircraft, systematically disabling every system with the precision of someone who knew exactly how to kill. a Boeing 757, and everyone aboard. Only the skill of the pilots, and perhaps some divine intervention, had prevented a tragedy that would have claimed 189 lives. The circuit breaker panel in that particular aircraft was replaced after the incident. But maintenance workers report that the new breakers sometimes pop out on their own during overnight inspections. And pilots flying over the Colorado Rockies sometimes report electrical anomalies in the same area where Flight 891 nearly crashed. As if something in those mountains still reaches out to aircraft passing overhead, trying to finish what it started on that terrifying night when the lights went out at 37,000 feet. Let's move to our 8th story. Flight attendant Rachel Kim had worked for Delta Airlines for 8 years, but she'd never experienced anything like what happened on Flight 447 during the red-eye from Miami to Boston. The Airbus A320 had taken off at 11:55 p.m. with 156 passengers aboard, most settling in for the overnight journey. Rachel was working the aft galley with her colleague Marcus when their routine night became a nightmare that would haunt her for the rest of her career. At 1:17 a.m., while cruising at 35,000 feet over the Atlantic, Rachel was preparing the breakfast service when she felt the aircraft suddenly pitch forward. Not the gentle descent that might indicate the beginning of approach procedures, but a violent, uncontrolled nosedive that sent her crashing into the galley counter. The aircraft's nose dropped so sharply that passengers who had been sleeping were thrown forward against their seatbelts. Overhead bins burst open, raining luggage and personal items down the aisles. The lights flickered and went out, plunging the cabin into darkness except for the eerie glow of emergency lighting strips along the floor. Rachel grabbed the interphone to contact the cockpit, but the line was dead. She could hear passengers screaming throughout the cabin as the aircraft continued its terrifying plunge toward the ocean below. The sensation was like being in an elevator with severed cables, a sickening free fall that seemed to go on forever. "Marcus," Rachel shouted over the chaos, "we need to get to the cockpit." But Marcus was pinned against the rear bulkhead by the extreme angle of the aircraft's descent. Passengers were sliding forward in their seats, some crying, others praying, all of them helpless against the forces of gravity and terror. Rachel fought her way through the tilted cabin, using seat backs to pull herself forward against the steep angle. The aircraft was diving so steeply that she was essentially climbing uphill through the passenger compartment. Behind her, she could hear the sounds of pure panic, screaming, crying, and the terrible noise of loose objects crashing through the cabin. As Rachel struggled toward the front of the aircraft, she noticed something that made the situation even more terrifying. The passengers weren't just scared, they were behaving strangely. Some were laughing hysterically while tears streamed down their faces. Others were speaking in languages that didn't sound human, making guttural sounds that seemed to come from somewhere deep in their throats. In seat 14C, an elderly businessman was clawing at his own face, leaving bloody scratches on his cheeks while muttering something about the water rising. In row 22, a young mother was holding her infant child above her head as if offering the baby to something invisible in the cabin's ceiling. Rachel had seen passengers panic before, but this was different. This wasn't just fear. It was as if something had taken control of their minds, driving them to behaviors that defied all logic and self-preservation. The aircraft's dive continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Rachel could feel her ears popping from the rapid altitude change, and she knew they were descending far too fast for any normal flight procedure. At this rate, they would hit the ocean in a matter of minutes. Finally reaching the cockpit door, Rachel pounded on it with both fists. "Captain, Captain, what's happening?" There was no response from inside the cockpit. Rachel tried her crew key, but the door wouldn't budge. She could hear voices from inside, not the calm, professional communication she expected from pilots dealing with an emergency, but what sounded like an argument, or perhaps a struggle. Through the small window in the cockpit door, Rachel could see Captain Stevens and First Officer Martinez at their stations. But their movements seemed erratic, almost violent. Captain Stevens appeared to be fighting with his controls, pulling back on the yoke with both hands, while First Officer Martinez was doing something at the overhead panel. But there was someone else in the cockpit, a third figure standing behind the pilot seats. Rachel pressed her face against the window to get a better look, and what she saw made her blood run cold. The third person was wearing a pilot's uniform, but the figure was translucent, like a projection or ghost. The ghostly pilot was reaching over Captain Stevens' shoulder, apparently trying to push the aircraft's controls forward, forcing the nosedive to continue. Rachel watched in horror as Captain Stevens fought against invisible hands that were trying to crash the aircraft. The captain's face was contorted with effort and terror as he struggled to regain control of his plane against an opponent he couldn't see or touch. The ghostly figure turned toward the cockpit door, and Rachel found herself looking into the face of a man she didn't recognize. He was probably in his 50s, with graying hair and eyes that held a depth of malice that made Rachel step back from the door. The ghost pilot looked directly at her through the window and smiled, a cold, predatory expression that conveyed pure evil. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the nosedive stopped. The aircraft leveled out with a violent jolt that threw Rachel against the cockpit door. Throughout the cabin, passengers who had been sliding forward suddenly found themselves thrown back into their seats. The lights flickered back on, and the normal sounds of flight, the hum of engines, the whisper of air conditioning, resumed as if nothing had happened. Rachel looked through the cockpit window again, but the ghostly third pilot was gone. Captain Stevens and First Officer Martinez were now working calmly at their stations, running through what appeared to be normal flight procedures. Rachel used her crew key to enter the cockpit. "Captain, what happened?" "We were in a nosedive for several minutes." Captain Stevens turned to look at her with confusion in his eyes. "Nosedive?" "Rachel, we've been in level flight for the past hour. Is everything all right?" "Sir," the aircraft pitched forward violently. "Passengers were thrown around the cabin. We lost cabin lighting. You were fighting with the controls." First Officer Martinez checked his instruments and shook his head. "Rachel, all our systems show normal flight. We're at 35,000 feet, airspeed 450 knots, everything nominal. We haven't had any unusual attitude changes." Rachel stared at the two pilots, unable to comprehend what she was hearing. "But I saw you struggling with someone in the cockpit. There was another pilot here trying to crash the plane." Captain Stevens and First Officer Martinez exchanged glances. "Rachel, there's no one else in the cockpit. There never has been. Are you feeling all right?" Rachel returned to the cabin, her mind reeling. But what she found there was even more disturbing than the pilot's denial. The passengers were all sitting calmly in their seats, many of them sleeping peacefully. The overhead bins were closed and secure. There was no sign of the chaos and terror that had filled the cabin just minutes before. Rachel approached the elderly businessman in 14C, the one she had seen clawing at his face. His cheeks were unmarked, and he was reading a magazine as if nothing had happened. "Sir, are you all right? You seemed distressed earlier." The man looked up at her with mild confusion. Distressed? No, I've been reading quietly since takeoff. Is there something wrong? Rachel checked on the young mother in row 22, but found her sleeping peacefully with her infant child resting comfortably in her arms. There was no sign of the bizarre behavior Rachel had witnessed during the nosedive. As Rachel walked through the cabin, she realized that none of the passengers remembered the incident. They all insisted that the flight had been smooth and uneventful. But Rachel could still feel the phantom sensation of the aircraft's violent dive, could still hear the echoes of screaming passengers in her memory. It was Marcus who provided the only confirmation that something had actually happened. "Rachel, I felt it too," he whispered when she returned to the aft galley. "The plane went into a dive, and the passengers went crazy. But look at this." Marcus showed Rachel his watch. According to the timepiece, it was 1:18 a.m., only 1 minute after the nosedive had begun. But Rachel was certain they had been in the dive for at least 10 minutes, possibly longer. "It's like time skipped," Marcus said. "Like whatever happened outside of normal time." The rest of the flight proceeded without incident. Flight 447 landed safely in Boston at 6:47 a.m., and the passengers deplaned normally, many commenting on how smooth and pleasant the flight had been. The post-flight inspection revealed no mechanical problems with the aircraft. The flight data recorders showed no unusual altitude changes, no sudden pitch movements, no deviation from normal flight parameters. According to every official record, Flight 447 had experienced a completely routine flight from Miami to Boston. But Rachel and Marcus knew what they had experienced. They had witnessed something that existed outside the normal rules of physics and time. A ghostly pilot who had tried to crash their aircraft, passengers driven to madness by supernatural forces, and a nosedive that had somehow occurred without actually happening. Rachel requested a transfer to domestic day flights after the incident. She never worked another red-eye flight, and she never flew over the Atlantic again. The memory of that ghostly pilot's malevolent smile haunted her dreams for years. The investigation into Flight 447 was quietly closed after finding no evidence of any anomaly. But Marcus discovered something in the airline's historical records that provided a chilling explanation for what they had experienced. 15 years earlier, an identical Airbus A320 had crashed into the Atlantic Ocean during a red-eye flight from Miami to Boston. The aircraft had gone into an unexplained nosedive at 35,000 feet, killing all 162 people aboard. The captain of that doomed flight had been a pilot named Robert Chen, a man whose description matched exactly the ghostly figure Rachel had seen in the cockpit. Captain Chen had suffered a complete mental breakdown during the flight, losing control of the aircraft and causing it to plunge toward the ocean, tragically claiming 161 innocent lives. And apparently, his tormented spirit continued to haunt flights along the same route, compelled to relive his final, devastating moments. Flight 447's encounter with the ghost of Captain Chen had lasted only 1 minute in real time. But in that minute, Rachel and Marcus had experienced the full horror of a crash that had been prevented only by the skill of their living pilots and perhaps some divine intervention. The aircraft that had been Flight 447 was quietly retired from the Miami-Boston route after the incident. But pilots flying that corridor sometimes report unexplained control difficulties at 35,000 feet, as if invisible hands are trying to push their aircraft into a fatal dive toward the dark waters below. Let's move to our 9th story. Dr. Jennifer Walsh had been working as an emergency physician for 12 years, but she'd never been called to treat a patient at 35,000 feet. as a member of the medical volunteer program for American Airlines. She occasionally assisted with in-flight medical emergencies, but most were routine: heart palpitations, anxiety attacks, or minor injuries. What happened on Flight 1823 from Los Angeles to Chicago was anything but routine. Jennifer was traveling in business class, Seat 3A, trying to catch some sleep during the red-eye flight when she was awakened by screaming from the back of the aircraft. It was 2:33 a.m., and most of the 178 passengers were sleeping when chaos erupted in the economy section. "Is there a doctor on board?" came the urgent announcement from the flight attendants. "We have a medical emergency in the rear cabin." Jennifer quickly made her way toward the back of the Boeing 777. But what she found wasn't a typical medical situation. In the center of the economy section, a massive man, easily 6'4" and weighing over 250 pounds of solid muscle, was standing in the aisle, throwing punches at invisible opponents while passengers cowered in their seats. The man was clearly an athlete, his physique suggesting he was likely a professional fighter or bodybuilder. His face was flushed red with exertion and fever, sweat pouring down his forehead despite the cool cabin temperature. But what made the situation truly terrifying was the look in his eyes. They were wild, unfocused, as if he was seeing things that weren't there. "Sir, I'm a doctor," Jennifer called out, keeping her distance. "Can you tell me your name?" The man spun toward her voice, his fists raised in a fighting stance. "They're everywhere," he shouted, his voice hoarse and desperate. "They're coming through the walls. Can't you see them?" Jennifer could see that the man was experiencing severe hallucinations, likely brought on by high fever. His skin had the flushed, dry appearance of someone burning up with infection, and she could hear his labored breathing from 10 feet away. "What's his name?" Jennifer asked the flight attendant, a young woman named Sarah who was pressed against the galley wall, clearly terrified. "Marcus Thompson. He's in seat 27B. He was fine when we took off, but about 20 minutes ago he started complaining about feeling hot. Then he just exploded." Jennifer watched as Marcus shadowboxed with hallucinated enemies, his massive fists cutting through the air with professional precision. Each punch was thrown with the skill of someone trained in combat sports, and Jennifer realized that if Marcus decided she was one of his imaginary opponents, she could be seriously injured or killed. "Marcus, my name is Dr. Walsh. I think you have a fever, and that's making you see things that aren't real. I want to help you." Marcus stopped fighting for a moment and looked directly at Jennifer. For a brief second, his eyes seemed to clear, and she could see the confusion and fear beneath the fever-induced madness. "Doctor," Marcus said, his voice suddenly small and vulnerable, "I don't feel good. Everything hurts, and I keep seeing things." Jennifer took a cautious step closer. "What kind of things, Marcus?" "Demons. They have claws and teeth, and they're trying to drag me somewhere dark. They keep whispering that I'm going to die on this plane." Jennifer's medical training told her that Marcus was likely suffering from pneumonia or another severe respiratory infection. The high fever was causing delirium and hallucinations, making him see threats where none existed. But her immediate concern was keeping him and the other passengers safe until they could get him proper medical treatment. "Marcus, I believe you're seeing these things, but they're not real. Your brain is sick right now because of a fever. Can you sit down so I can examine you? For a moment, it seemed like Marcus might comply. He took a step toward his seat, his massive frame swaying slightly. But then his expression changed again, the wild look returning to his eyes. "No!" Marcus screamed, spinning around to face the opposite direction. "There's one behind me. It's got wings like a bat and it's reaching for my neck." Marcus launched into another flurry of punches, this time directed at the overhead bins. His fists connected with the plastic panels with sickening thuds, and Jennifer could see blood beginning to flow from his knuckles. But Marcus didn't seem to feel the pain. The fever had pushed him beyond normal physical sensations. Passengers in nearby seats were scrambling to get away from the violent display. An elderly couple in row 26 was trapped, unable to get past Marcus's thrashing form. The woman was crying, and her husband was trying to shield her with his body. "Sarah, we need to clear this entire section," Jennifer told the flight attendant. "Get everyone moved to the front of the plane, and tell the captain we need to divert to the nearest airport immediately." As Sarah began evacuating passengers, Jennifer tried a different approach with Marcus. She had treated delusional patients before, and sometimes the best strategy was to work within their altered reality rather than fighting against it. "Marcus, I can see the demons too," Jennifer lied, hoping to gain his trust. "But I have special medicine that can make them go away. Will you let me help you fight them?" Marcus stopped punching and looked at Jennifer with desperate hope in his eyes. "You can see them? You can make them stop?" "Yes. But I need you to sit down so I can give you the medicine. The demons are afraid of doctors. That's why they're staying back right now." Marcus nodded eagerly and stumbled toward his seat. Jennifer quickly moved to examine him, keeping her movements slow and non-threatening. His skin was burning hot to the touch. She estimated his temperature at least 104 degrees Fahrenheit. His breathing was rapid and shallow, and she could hear crackling sounds in his lungs that confirmed her suspicion of pneumonia. "Marcus, I'm going to give you some medicine now," Jennifer said, pulling out a small bottle of ibuprofen from her purse. "This will make the demons go away and help you feel better." She gave Marcus 4 ibuprofen tablets, knowing they would help reduce his fever but wouldn't address the underlying infection. What Marcus really needed was intravenous antibiotics and professional medical care. But they were still hours away from landing. For a few minutes, Marcus seemed calmer. The placebo effect of believing he had received demon-fighting medicine appeared to be working. But Jennifer knew it wouldn't last long. His fever was too high and the infection was too severe. "Doctor?" Marcus whispered, grabbing Jennifer's arm with surprising gentleness. "I'm scared. I've never been scared of anything before, but these things, they're not from this world." Jennifer looked into Marcus's eyes and saw not the professional fighter he clearly was, but a frightened man who was losing his grip on reality. "Tell me about yourself, Marcus. What do you do for work?" "I'm an MMA fighter, UFC heavyweight division. I've never lost a fight, never backed down from anyone. But these demons, I can't hurt them. My punches just go right through them." Jennifer realized that Marcus's fighting background was making his hallucinations even more dangerous. His instinct when threatened was to use violence, and his professional training made that violence potentially lethal to anyone nearby. It was then that Marcus's condition took a turn for the worse. His breathing became even more labored, and Jennifer could see that his lips were beginning to turn blue, a sign that he wasn't getting enough oxygen. "Sarah!" Jennifer called to the flight attendant. "Do we have oxygen on board?" "Yes, in the emergency medical kit." "Get it now, and tell the captain we need to land immediately. This man is going into respiratory failure." As Sarah rushed to get the oxygen, Marcus began to panic again. The lack of oxygen to his brain was making his hallucinations more vivid and terrifying. "They're back," Marcus screamed, struggling to stand up. "There are more of them now. They're surrounding the plane." Jennifer tried to keep Marcus seated, but even weakened by illness, he was incredibly strong. He pushed her aside and began throwing punches at the aircraft's windows, apparently trying to fight off demons he believed were attacking the plane from outside. "Marcus, you need to breathe slowly," Jennifer said, trying to stay calm despite the chaos. "The oxygen will help clear your head." But Marcus was beyond reasoning now. The combination of high fever, oxygen deprivation, and whatever infection was ravaging his system had pushed him into a state of complete delirium. He was fighting for his life against enemies that existed only in his fevered imagination. Sarah returned with a portable oxygen tank, and Jennifer managed to get the mask over Marcus's face during a brief moment when he paused his shadow boxing. The oxygen seemed to help slightly. His breathing became less labored, and some of the blue tinge left his lips. "The demons are getting weaker," Jennifer told Marcus, continuing to work within his delusion. "The oxygen is like poison to them. Keep breathing it in." For the next hour, Jennifer stayed with Marcus, monitoring his condition and trying to keep him calm. The oxygen helped, but she could see that he was getting worse overall. His fever remained dangerously high, and his periods of lucidity were becoming shorter and less frequent. Captain Rodriguez announced that they were diverting to Kansas City, where medical personnel would be waiting. But Jennifer wasn't sure Marcus would survive until landing. His breathing was becoming increasingly difficult, and she could see signs that his body was beginning to shut down from the infection. At 4:17 a.m., Marcus suddenly grabbed Jennifer's hand with surprising strength. His eyes were clear for the first time in hours, and when he spoke, his voice was rational and coherent. "Doctor, I'm dying, aren't I?" Jennifer looked into his eyes and saw that the fever had broken momentarily, giving Marcus a brief window of clarity. "You're very sick, Marcus. But we're going to land soon, and the doctors at the hospital will take good care of you." "I can feel it," Marcus said quietly. "My body's given up. The demons, they weren't trying to hurt me. They were trying to take me somewhere. Somewhere I'm supposed to go." Jennifer felt tears welling up in her eyes. In her years as an emergency physician, she had seen many patients face death. But there was something particularly heartbreaking about watching this powerful man accept his fate with such grace. "Marcus, you're a fighter. Don't give up now." Marcus smiled weakly. "I've been fighting my whole life, Doc. Maybe it's time to stop fighting and just let go." Flight 1823 landed in Kansas City at 4:52 a.m. Paramedics rushed aboard and immediately began working on Marcus. But it was too late. He died during transport to the hospital, his body finally succumbing to the massive infection that had turned his final hours into a waking nightmare. The autopsy revealed that Marcus had been suffering from a rare form of pneumonia that had spread to his brain, causing the hallucinations and delirium. The infection had been so severe that even with immediate medical intervention, his chances of survival would have been minimal. Jennifer never forgot Marcus Thompson or the demons he fought in his final hours. She often wondered if, in his fevered state, Marcus had seen something real, perhaps glimpses of whatever awaits us beyond death. His hallucinations had been so vivid, so specific that sometimes Jennifer found herself believing that Marcus really had been fighting supernatural forces for his soul at 35,000 feet. The other passengers on Flight 1823 were offered counseling after witnessing Marcus's terrifying final battle. Most tried to forget what they had seen, but some reported having nightmares about demons with claws and wings, as if Marcus's hallucinations had somehow infected their own minds. Jennifer continued her work as an emergency physician, but she never volunteered for in-flight medical assistance again. She had learned that sometimes the most dangerous enemies we face are the ones that exist only in our minds, and that even the strongest among us can be brought down by invisible demons that no amount of training or courage can defeat. Marcus Thompson's final fight wasn't in the octagon against a human opponent, but in the sky against hallucinations born from fever and fear. And in the end, even the toughest fighter couldn't win a battle against an enemy that existed only in the darkness of his own dying mind. Let's move to our 10th story. Ground Operations Supervisor Janet Morrison had worked at Atlanta Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport for 16 years, and she prided herself on being able to handle any crisis that came her way. From weather delays to mechanical failures, from security incidents to medical emergencies, Janet had seen it all. But nothing in her experience had prepared her for the 3 days of cascading disasters that would later be known among airport staff as the Nightmare Weekend. It started on a Friday night in November when Janet was working the overnight shift, coordinating ground operations for the busiest airport in the world. The night began routinely enough, flights arriving and departing on schedule, baggage being loaded and unloaded, fuel trucks making their rounds. But at 11:47 p.m., everything began to go wrong in ways that seemed too coordinated to be coincidental. The first incident occurred at Gate 12, where Delta Flight 2847 from Detroit was preparing for departure to Miami. As the Boeing 737 was being pushed back from the gate, the tug operator suddenly lost control of his vehicle. The massive pushback tug veered sharply to the right, jackknifing the aircraft and causing significant damage to both the plane's nose gear and the jet bridge. Janet rushed to the scene to coordinate the emergency response, but before she could fully assess the situation, her radio crackled with another emergency call. At Gate B7, an American Airlines flight from Dallas had blown both main landing gear tires during landing, blocking the runway and forcing air traffic control to divert incoming flights to alternate airports. Control, this is Morrison. I need emergency vehicles at Gate B7 immediately. We have an aircraft disabled on runway 26 right. But as Janet was coordinating the response to the tire blowout, a third emergency developed. The fuel truck servicing United Flight 891 at Gate C15 had somehow overfilled the aircraft's tanks, causing jet fuel to spill across the tarmac and creating a massive fire hazard. The entire C concourse had to be evacuated as hazmat teams worked to contain the spill. Within the span of 30 minutes, Janet was dealing with 3 separate emergencies that had effectively shut down major portions of the airport. But what made the situation truly disturbing was the pattern she began to notice in the incidents. Each emergency had been caused by equipment failure, but not random mechanical breakdowns. The pushback tug steering system had been deliberately tampered with. The aircraft that blew its tires had been serviced earlier that evening, and someone had partially deflated the tires just enough to cause failure during landing. The fuel truck's automatic shutoff valve had been disabled, allowing the dangerous overfill to occur. "This isn't a series of accidents," Janet told her assistant, Mike Rodriguez, as they coordinated the emergency response. "Someone is sabotaging our operations." But before Janet could investigate further, the situation escalated dramatically. At 1:23 a.m., the airport's main electrical grid suffered a cascading failure that plunged half of the terminal complex into darkness. Emergency generators kicked in, but they were only designed to power essential systems, leaving most of the airport operating on minimal lighting and reduced capacity. Janet made her way to the electrical control room, where she found maintenance supervisor Tom Bradley staring at a bank of monitors showing the airport's power distribution system. "Tom, what caused the grid failure?" Janet asked. Bradley pointed to his screens, his face pale with concern. "Janet, this wasn't a random power failure. Someone with intimate knowledge of our electrical systems systematically overloaded key transformers. They knew exactly which circuits to target to cause maximum disruption while avoiding the emergency systems." As if the power failure wasn't enough, Janet's radio erupted with reports of a new crisis. The airport's baggage handling system had malfunctioned, sending thousands of pieces of luggage careening through the automated conveyor network at dangerous speeds. Bags were flying off conveyor belts, jamming sorting mechanisms, and creating chaos throughout the baggage claim areas. Janet rushed to the baggage control center, where she found technician Lisa Park frantically trying to shut down the runaway system. "Lisa, what's the status?" "Someone hacked into our baggage control software," Lisa said, her fingers flying over the keyboard. "They've overridden all the safety protocols and set the conveyor speeds to maximum. I can't regain control of the system." Janet watched in horror as security cameras showed luggage flying through the baggage areas like missiles, some bags bursting open and scattering contents across the floor. Passengers waiting for their luggage were diving for cover as suitcases launched off conveyor belts at high speed. By 3 a.m., Janet realized she was dealing with a coordinated attack on the airport's infrastructure. Someone with extensive knowledge of Hartsfield-Jackson systems was systematically targeting different operational areas, creating chaos and putting lives at risk. But the worst was yet to come. At 3:47 a.m., the airport's air traffic control system began experiencing intermittent failures. Radar screens would flicker and go dark for several seconds at a time, leaving controllers unable to track aircraft in the busy Atlanta airspace. Radio communications with pilots became sporadic, with transmissions cutting out at critical moments. Janet made her way to the control tower, where she found air traffic supervisor Captain Sarah Chen coordinating with controllers who were struggling to maintain safe separation between aircraft using backup systems. "Sarah, how bad is it?" Janet asked. "It's a nightmare," Chen replied, her voice tight with stress. "We've got planes stacked up in holding patterns because we can't guarantee safe approaches. The radar keeps cutting out, and our radio systems are failing intermittently. If this continues, we're going to have to shut down all air traffic." Janet looked out at the tarmac, where she could see aircraft lined up on taxiways, unable to take off due to the control system failures. Passengers were stranded in planes that couldn't depart, while incoming flights were being diverted to airports hundreds of miles away. As Saturday morning dawned, Janet had been awake for over 20 hours, coordinating responses to a series of crises that had brought one of the world's busiest airports to its knees. But the nightmare was far from over. At 7:15 a.m., the airport's fire suppression system activated throughout Terminal A, flooding the concourse with foam and forcing the evacuation of thousands of passengers. The system had been triggered by false alarms that had been planted throughout the terminal by someone with access to the building's security systems. Janet stood in the parking lot outside Terminal A, watching as passengers streamed out of the building covered in fire suppression foam, and realized that whoever was behind these attacks had planned them with military precision. Each incident had been timed to maximize chaos and strain the airport's emergency response capabilities. "Janet!" Mike Rodriguez approached her with a grim expression. "I've been analyzing the timing of all these incidents. They're not random. Someone has been studying our emergency response protocols and timing each attack to occur just as we're getting the previous one under control." Janet nodded, having reached the same conclusion. "Mike, this is psychological warfare. Someone is trying to break us down systematically." Saturday brought no relief. The attacks continued with relentless precision. Computer viruses crashed the flight information systems, causing confusion and panic among passengers. The airport's water supply was contaminated with a harmless but foul-smelling chemical that forced the closure of restaurants and restrooms. And the parking garage's automated payment systems were hacked, trapping thousands of cars and their owners. By Saturday night, Janet was running on pure adrenaline and determination. She had been coordinating crisis response for over 36 hours straight, and she could feel her body beginning to shut down from exhaustion and stress. But she refused to leave her post while the airport was under attack. It was then that Janet began to notice something even more disturbing than the coordinated nature of the attacks. The person or persons responsible seemed to know exactly how she would respond to each crisis. Every time Janet deployed resources to handle one emergency, a new crisis would develop in an area she had just left unprotected. "It's like they're watching us," Janet told Mike as they coordinated the response to the latest incident. A chemical spill in the international terminal that had forced the evacuation of an entire concourse. "They know our procedures, our response times, even our personnel assignments." Sunday brought the final phase of the nightmare. At 2 a.m., every electronic system in the airport began failing simultaneously. Flight information displays went dark, security cameras stopped working, communication systems crashed, and even the basic lighting and ventilation systems began shutting down. Janet found herself coordinating emergency response by flashlight and handheld radio, trying to maintain some semblance of order as the airport descended into chaos. Passengers were stranded in darkened terminals, flights were grounded indefinitely, and the economic impact was mounting by the hour. It was at 4:33 a.m. on Sunday that Janet finally collapsed. The combination of 3 days without sleep, constant stress, and the overwhelming responsibility of keeping the airport operational had pushed her body beyond its limits. She suffered a massive heart attack in the emergency command center and was rushed to the hospital. Janet Morrison died at 6:17 a.m. on Sunday morning, her heart unable to withstand the strain of the 3-day nightmare that had consumed her life. She was found clutching her radio, still trying to coordinate emergency response even as her body was shutting down. The attacks on Hartsfield-Jackson Airport stopped immediately after Janet's death, as if her passing had been the ultimate goal all along. Systems began coming back online, equipment started functioning normally, and within hours, the airport was returning to normal operations. The investigation into the 3-day nightmare revealed a disturbing truth. All of the attacks had been orchestrated by a single individual, a former airport employee named David Chen, who had been fired from his position as a systems analyst 2 years earlier. Chen had spent those 2 years planning his revenge against the airport, and specifically against Janet Morrison, whom he blamed for his termination. Chen had used his intimate knowledge of the airport systems to create a campaign of terror designed not just to disrupt operations, but to literally work Janet Morrison to death. He had studied her work patterns, her dedication to her job, and her refusal to abandon her post during emergencies. Chen had weaponized Janet's own sense of duty against her. David Chen was found unconscious in his apartment 3 days after Janet's passing, having collapsed from a fatal heart attack brought on by the extreme stress of orchestrating the attacks. Medical examiners discovered detailed plans for the sabotage and notes revealing that his ultimate target had never been the airport itself, but Janet Morrison personally. His obsession with revenge had literally consumed him from within. Janet Morrison was posthumously awarded the airport's highest honor for her dedication and sacrifice during the 3-day nightmare. A memorial plaque in the main terminal reads, "In memory of Janet Morrison, who gave her life to keep travelers safe." But airport employees know that Janet's spirit still watches over Hartsfield-Jackson. During overnight shifts, supervisors sometimes report receiving radio calls from Janet's voice, warning them about potential problems or guiding them through difficult situations. Her dedication to the airport was so complete that not even death could make her abandon her post. The 3-day nightmare serves as a reminder that the most dangerous attacks on our infrastructure often come from those who know it best, and that sometimes the greatest weapon against us is our own sense of duty and dedication to protecting others. Janet Morrison's final shift lasted 3 days and cost her everything. But her sacrifice ensured that thousands of travelers made it home safely during one of the darkest weekends in aviation history. Let's move to our 11th and final story. Night shift supervisor Robert Hayes had worked at Boston Logan International Airport for 19 years. And he thought he understood the rhythm of overnight operations. The quiet hours between midnight and dawn, when most of the world slept and only essential personnel kept the airport running. But what happened during his final shift would prove that some jobs demand more than anyone should be asked to give. It was 1:45 a.m. on a cold February morning when Robert received the call that would change everything. He was in his office in Terminal C, reviewing staffing schedules for the upcoming week, when his radio crackled with an urgent message from gate agent Maria Santos. "Control, this is Santos at Gate C7. I need a supervisor immediately. We have a situation with Flight 2847 from Miami." Robert made his way to Gate C7, where he found Maria standing beside the jet bridge with a look of confusion and concern on her face. The Boeing 767 had arrived 20 minutes earlier, but the passengers were still on board. "What's the situation, Maria?" Robert asked. "The passengers won't deplane," Maria said, her voice tight with stress. "They're all sitting in their seats, but they won't respond to announcements. The flight crew says they've been trying to get them to disembark for 15 minutes, but it's like they can't hear us." Robert looked through the jet bridge window into the aircraft. He could see passengers sitting motionless in their seats, staring straight ahead with blank expressions. None of them were moving, talking, or showing any signs of normal behavior. "Have you contacted medical services?" Robert asked. "That's the thing," Maria said. "The flight crew says the passengers were fine during the flight. Normal conversation, normal behavior. But as soon as we arrived at the gate, they all just stopped." Robert entered the aircraft to assess the situation firsthand. What he found inside was deeply unsettling. All 156 passengers were sitting perfectly still, their eyes open but unfocused, as if they were in some kind of trance. They were breathing normally, but they showed no response to verbal commands or physical contact. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the gate supervisor." Robert announced over the aircraft's PA system. "Please gather your belongings and exit the aircraft." Not a single passenger moved or acknowledged his announcement. Robert approached a businessman in seat 12A and gently touched his shoulder. "Sir, we've arrived in Boston. You need to deplane now." The man didn't respond. His eyes remained fixed on the seat back in front of him, and his breathing was slow and regular, as if he was in a deep sleep with his eyes open. Flight attendant Jennifer Park approached Robert with obvious concern. "Mr. Hayes, this started about 10 minutes before we landed. The passengers were all talking and moving around normally, and then suddenly they all went quiet at the same time. It was like someone flipped a switch." Robert had dealt with medical emergencies before, but nothing like this. He called for paramedics and airport security, but as they waited for help to arrive, Robert began to notice something that made the situation even more disturbing. The passengers weren't just motionless. They were all staring in the same direction. Every single person on the aircraft was looking toward the front of the plane, their eyes focused on something beyond the cockpit that Robert couldn't see. "Jennifer, what's at the front of the aircraft that they might be looking at?" Robert asked. "Nothing unusual, just the cockpit and the forward galley." "But Mr. Hayes, there's something else. Look at their faces." Robert studied the passengers more carefully and saw what Jennifer meant. Despite their blank expressions, there was something in their eyes. Not fear exactly, but a kind of recognition, as if they were seeing something that commanded their complete attention. The paramedics arrived and began examining the passengers, but their findings were baffling. All vital signs were normal: heart rate, blood pressure, breathing, pupil response. The passengers appeared to be in perfect health, but they remained completely unresponsive to external stimuli. "It's like they're in a collective catatonic state," the lead paramedic told Robert. "But I've never seen anything like this. Usually catatonia affects individuals, not entire groups simultaneously." As the medical team worked, Robert noticed that the aircraft's atmosphere felt different. The air seemed thicker somehow, and there was a subtle electrical charge that made the hair on his arms stand up. The temperature in the cabin had dropped noticeably, despite the aircraft's environmental systems running normally. It was then that Robert saw him. At the very front of the aircraft, standing in the doorway between the cockpit and the first-class cabin, was a figure that shouldn't have been there. An elderly man in a pilot's uniform, but not one of the crew members who had flown the aircraft from Miami. This pilot was translucent, like a projection, and he was gesturing toward the passengers as if conducting an orchestra. Robert blinked hard, thinking he was seeing things due to stress and fatigue. But when he looked again, the ghostly pilot was still there. And Robert realized that this was what all the passengers were staring at. They could see the apparition, and it was holding them in some kind of supernatural trance. "Jennifer," Robert whispered to the flight attendant, "do you see anyone standing at the front of the cabin?" Jennifer looked toward the cockpit area and shook her head. "No, there's no one there." "Why?" Robert realized that he was the only one who could see the ghostly pilot. The passengers could see him too, but the crew and medical personnel were blind to the apparition that was somehow controlling 156 people. The ghostly pilot turned toward Robert and smiled, a cold, predatory expression that conveyed malevolent intelligence. Then the figure raised his hand and pointed directly at Robert, as if selecting him for something. Robert felt a sudden, crushing pain in his chest. His heart began racing irregularly, and he could feel sweat breaking out on his forehead despite the cool cabin temperature. The ghostly pilot was somehow affecting Robert's cardiovascular system, just as he was controlling the minds of the passengers. "I need medical attention," Robert gasped, clutching his chest as the pain intensified. The paramedics immediately turned their attention to Robert, but as they began examining him, something extraordinary happened. The passengers began to move. As Robert's condition deteriorated, the passengers slowly started to respond to their surroundings. They blinked, looked around in confusion, and began gathering their belongings as if nothing unusual had happened. Within minutes, they were deplaning normally, chatting among themselves about their flight and their plans in Boston. But Robert's condition continued to worsen. The pain in his chest was becoming unbearable, and he could feel his heart struggling to maintain a normal rhythm. The ghostly pilot remained visible to him, still pointing in his direction, still smiling that terrible smile. "Get him to the hospital immediately," the lead paramedic ordered as Robert collapsed onto one of the aircraft seats. As the medical team prepared to transport Robert to the ambulance, he managed to grab Jennifer's arm. "The pilot?" he whispered. "The dead pilot at the front of the cabin. He's taking my life to free the passengers." Jennifer looked confused, but Robert could see understanding dawning in her eyes. She had heard stories from other flight attendants about supernatural encounters, and she was beginning to realize that Robert was experiencing something beyond normal medical emergency. Robert was rushed to Massachusetts General Hospital, but the damage to his heart was too severe. The ghostly pilot had somehow triggered a massive cardiac event that Robert's body couldn't survive. He died at 4:17 a.m., less than 3 hours after encountering the apparition on Flight 2847. The investigation into the incident revealed disturbing parallels to other supernatural encounters in aviation. The ghostly pilot that Robert had seen matched the description of Captain William Morrison, who had died in a crash at Logan Airport 15 years earlier. Captain Morrison had been attempting an emergency landing when his aircraft went down, killing him and his co-pilot, but somehow sparing all 156 passengers. The passengers on Flight 2847 had no memory of their trance-like state. When questioned, they all insisted that the flight had been completely normal and that they had deplaned immediately upon arrival. Security footage from the aircraft showed the passengers sitting motionless for exactly the same amount of time that Robert had been experiencing his cardiac emergency. Robert Hayes was posthumously recognized for his dedication to passenger safety. But airport employees knew the real story. Robert had encountered the ghost of Captain Morrison, who had somehow been holding the passengers of Flight 2847 in supernatural captivity. The only way to free them had been for someone else to take their place. And Robert had paid that price with his life. The aircraft that had been Flight 2847 was retired from service after the incident. But the ghost of Captain Morrison continued to haunt Logan Airport. Night shift supervisors sometimes reported seeing a figure in a pilot's uniform walking through the terminals, always checking on passengers, always ensuring their safety. And sometimes, when flights arrived late at night with passengers who seemed unusually quiet or subdued, airport personnel would remember Robert Hayes and wonder if Captain Morrison was still claiming lives to protect the travelers under his supernatural care. Robert's final act had been to save 156 passengers from a fate worse than death. Eternal captivity in the limbo between life and death that Captain Morrison had created. His sacrifice ensured that those passengers could return to their families, their lives, their futures. But the cost had been everything Robert had to give, and his death served as a reminder that some supernatural encounters demand the ultimate price from those brave enough to confront them. The night shift at Logan Airport continues, but Robert Hayes' empty office stands as a monument to the supervisor who gave his life to ensure that passengers could go home safely, even when the forces holding them captive came from beyond the grave. If you work in aviation, especially during the overnight hours, remember that you're not just dealing with mechanical systems and passenger logistics. You're operating in a realm where the boundaries between life and death, between the possible and impossible, become dangerously thin. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. And never assume that what you're seeing can be explained by logic alone. The men and women whose stories we've shared tonight, Sophia Rodriguez, David Chen, Maria Santos, Jake Thompson, Tommy Nguyen, Kevin Lawson, Captain Torres, Rachel Kim, Dr. Walsh, Janet Morrison, and Robert Hayes, all learned that the night shift in aviation comes with risks that no training manual can prepare you for. Some survived their encounters. Others paid the ultimate price. Your journey into darkness continues here. If these stories have left you questioning what lurks in the shadows of our everyday world, then you're ready for more. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell because Verified Fears is just getting started. We have dozens more true horror stories waiting to be told. Stories that will make tonight's airline nightmares seem like bedtime tales. Comment below and tell us, have you ever worked a night shift in aviation? Have you experienced anything that couldn't be explained? Your story might be featured in our next video, and trust me, our community of horror enthusiasts is waiting to hear from you. Don't watch alone. Share this video with someone brave enough to handle the truth about what really happens when the sun goes down and the night shift begins. Because after tonight, you'll never look at air travel the same way again. Next week, we're diving into the abandoned coal mines of Appalachia, where miners who died decades ago still show up for their shifts. You won't want to miss what we've uncovered in those dark tunnels beneath the mountains. Until then, remember, the next time you're on a late-night flight and you hear footsteps in the cabin above you, or see a passenger who seems just a little too still, or notice your flight attendant looking worried about something they can't explain, you'll know that you're not just traveling through the sky. You're traveling through the realm where the living and the dead share the same airspace, and where some passengers never really reach their final destination. Sweet dreams and safe travels.